in WMATA. I will say Supervisor Meyer has been my friend and colleague on the Board of Supervisors. I'm going to miss him tremendously on the board, but we've done a lot of really cool things together in the Silver Line Corridor. I think he might be the only Republican supervisor to have been endorsed by Greater Washington for his support for transit. So can I have a motion to commend Supervisor Meyer for his service? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
One, two, three.
It's going on the daily cause.
Fairfax County Supervisor John Cook. Fairfax County Supervisor Cook has represented Fairfax on the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission since 2010, serving as chair of the former Governance and Personnel Committee from 2017 to 2018. Supervisor Cook is also appointed to the VRE Operations Board from 2010 to 2019, serving as its chair in 2015 and secretary in 2019. While serving as chair of the VRE Operations Board, Mr. Cook guided the board in implementing recommendations of a 2015 VRE management audit, which included new governance models for the commuter rail system that have been instrumental in helping VRE achieve remarkable growth and the ability to provide safe, cost-effective, and comfortable commuter rail service in Northern Virginia. NVTC and VRE have benefited from Supervisor Cook's ability to synthesize information, build consensus among colleagues to reach the best conclusions to solve challenging issues facing Northern Virginia. Thank you very much, Supervisor Cook. I know I have personally just learned from you here, especially your background in labor and employment issues. It's been very valuable to us as we've dealt with some of those in our time in NVTC and elsewhere. So can I have a motion to approve a resolution of commendation for Supervisor Cook?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, we've had some great commissioners here who are leaving us tonight, and now for the last two, we're sort of moving into the legend category because these two individuals have been with the commission for so long and have contributed so much. Fairfax County Supervisor Kathy Hutchins. Fairfax County Board of Supervisor Kathy Hutchins has represented Fairfax County on the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission since 2004, serving as chair of the NVTC WMATA Committee in 2019. As a thoughtful, steady, and insightful leader who's a voice of reason and an agent for change, Supervisor Hutchins has shown her dedication and advocacy for transit by serving as the NVTC Principal Director for WMATA Board of Directors from 2008 to 2018, serving as board chair in 2011 and 2012, and the NVTC alternate director to the WMATA board in 2004, 2018, and 2019. As WMATA board chair in 2011, Supervisor Hutchins spearheaded several changes to improve WMATA's governance and oversaw a process in which the transit agency adopted its first ever bylaws and modernized code of ethics during a turbulent time for transit agency following the fatal train-on-train collision in 2009. She prioritized safety, investing in the equipment, facilities, and personnel needed to enhance safety, and establishing policies and procedures that enhance system safety during her tenure as WMATA board chair. Supervisor Hutchins also had a key role in ensuring the completion of the Metro Rail Silver Line's first phase to Reston and securing an agreement that allowed for construction of the second phase to Dulles International Airport and Loudoun County. Can I have a motion to approve a resolution of commendation for Supervisor Kathy Hutchins' service at NVTC? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Supervisor Hutchins. Anything you want to say?
It's an extension of the meeting, it's that.
No, I do want to say it's been a joy to work with so many of you over all these multiple years. And it has been, I think, a very favored commission for me in terms of my dedication to transit and knowing the importance of it in my community. So thank you all, and I wish you all well. Thank you.
And finally, Fairfax County Chairwoman Sharon Belova. Fairfax County Board of Supervisors Chairman Sharon Belova had joined the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission in 1988, serving as chair in 1996 and secretary treasurer in 2019. When Sharon departs NVTC, she will be the commission's longest serving member, having made an indelible mark on transportation, especially in public transit, during her 30-plus years of service. Chairman Belova's efforts in founding VRE, bringing Metrorail to Tysons and Dulles International Airport, and advocating for high-quality transportation have contributed greatly to Northern Virginia's quality of life and economic vitality. She's known as a congenial and pragmatic elected official who builds consensus by working individually with each of her fellow commissioners. She is a founding member and the longest continuously serving member on the Virginia Railway Express Operations Board, where she has been instrumental in helping VRE achieve remarkable growth and the ability to provide safe, cost-effective, accessible, reliable, convenient, and comfortable commuter rail services. She's worked with her colleagues as chair of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors to obtain the largest TIFIA loan ever issued by the federal government to help fund the $5.8 billion WMATA Silver Line project. I'll just say, on a personal note, I always tell people, if you can't get along with Sharon, then the problem is with you. It really is, because I'll never forget when I was first elected to the Board of Supervisors. I think it was the Committee for Dulles dinner in 2011, and Scott York was our chairman and brought me forward and said, I need you to meet Sharon because she's going to be a very important person for you to work with. And he was absolutely right. So it's been a pleasure. Is there a resolution of commendation for Chairman Belova's service on the NVTC? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Two, three. Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Let me give you that.
Thank you.
Sharon, would you please say a few words?
I'm happy to say a few words. NVTC has been like a family to me over the years. And, this is where major transportation has happened. I came on board when we were thinking about trying to get the VRE started. And it was a study here at NVTC that indicated that that was feasible. And then look over the years at what has happened. This organization has changed over the years, has been busier, not so busy. It's been under siege in years. But right now, boy, I'm leaving NVTC in the most amazing place. So things are really happening at this organization. This is a key place to make things happen and make positive changes happen for the region. It is so not easy. And so the issues, that we wrestle with and deal with are not always easy things to do. And they require collaboration among different jurisdictions and different parties, people who come from different places, with different perspectives, but it gets ironed out here. And so I leave knowing that NVTC in the region is in really good hands. Thank you so much.
Okay, as cake is delivered, we will move on to more mundane matters. Next of which is to approve our consent agenda, which is authorizing the executive director to issue a RFP for creative design services. Is Is that the only item, Kate?
That is the only
Okay.
one.
All right, so is there a motion to approve? Second. All right, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Anybody abstain? Motion carries unanimously. So next, we are going to accept and authorize distribution of NVTC's FY19 audited financial statements and compliance reports. We are going to hear a presentation from PB Mayers. So I think, Scott, you are introducing our auditors.
Tonight we have Mike Barber, his partner at NVTC. Review the financials.
There's no way to follow what just happened with the 8 people retiring, so you bring in the auditor. It's just, who else are you going to bring in to top that?
To spice things up.
Yes, spice things up. You know that's how it works. You've been through way too many of these presentations, so you know that. I didn't get a chance to meet with the executive committee beforehand. They had a lot on their plate to discuss, and I had a 30-minute presentation prepared for them. So you get to hear all 30 minutes of it. No, it'll probably take about 2 minutes. I think everything was handed out to you that we issued. There's a management letter, there's a report to the commissioners, and then of course there's the audit on the financial statements themselves. And I don't know if you received those in your board packets ahead of time. If you didn't, hopefully you'll have a chance to look through these this evening and over your Christmas break. I'm sure this is exactly what you'll turn to. The highlights are, there are 3 opinions in the financial statements. There's one on the actual financial statements themselves. There's an opinion on internal control and compliance. And there's also a 3rd opinion on the federal rewards that NVTC expends during the year. All 3 of those opinions are clean, or what we call unmodified opinions. So the management and this board and everyone should be commended once again for having 3 clean opinions on those items. Other items I think that are important to note: one, when we come in to do our audit work and we get information from Scott and his team, we had no journal entries this year, which is excellent. When we're doing our work and doing our testing, we had no past adjustments either. So everything that we looked at, all the documentation that we reviewed and tied back to the trial balances, everything there matched up, which is great. Makes management's life easier. Certainly makes our life a little bit easier as well. While performing our audit, asking questions, gathering information, things of that nature, we had no issues. Everything was answered fully that we are aware of. No problems in gathering information, putting these documents together, and coming up with footnotes and things of that nature. The management letter, there's really no items of significance in that document. It is simply laying out the GASB pronouncements that we will be adopting prospectively. And so in the years that those will come into play for the commission. There is one new table in the financial statements this year, and we don't need to turn there, but if you're curious, at June 30, of course, almost 6 months have passed since that time period that we looked at this, but on page 53 of the document, there is a new table that just details out where we have commitments with our new I-66 toll revenue, contract we've signed, how much we've spent to date, and how much of those contracts are remaining. So as you look at that fund and you look at the fund balance, at June 30, there was a little bit over $25 million there that's restricted. Over 15 million of that is already committed to projects that you have ongoing. And I know you all are very keenly aware of those projects and what's going on there. So, with that, I don't have anything else. I took that 30 minutes down for you. I know you got a lot to get through, but I'm happy to entertain any questions that you may have.
Yeah, I don't want to, all jokes aside, I don't want to rush over this. It is important. I think the good news is we have a great audit report, so there isn't a lot of concern here. But if anybody does have questions, even beyond this meeting, you're certainly
We're
available.
always available. Absolutely. Comments, questions, additional work, absolutely.
Okay,
Great. Thank you all very much.
so we need a motion to accept and authorize distribution of the FY19 audited financial statements and compliance reports.
Second.
Moved and seconded by Ms. Belova. Any discussion on that motion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Anybody abstain? Motion carries unanimously. Okay. So we're going to spend some time on the next item, And in front of you, you should have a document that looks like this with some red lines to it. These are the proposed amendments to the I-66 Memorandum of Agreement. NVTC entered into an agreement with the Commonwealth in 2015 to accept a portion of revenues from 66 inside the Beltway. We've collected more than $40 million in toll revenue funding, and it's gone to 36 projects, moving 8,000 people through the corridor each day. In December of 2017, we initiated discussions with NVTC. The Commonwealth approached us with a proposal to use a portion of toll revenues to pay for debt service on major transit improvements that would include the Long Bridge and Metro Rail improvements in Roslyn. The Commission decided to postpone decisions at that time. Last month, those of you that were here will recall that Secretary Donahue returned to talk about the Commonwealth's proposal, which would seek to use a portion of toll revenues to fund capital projects, including Long Bridge and Roslyn. We had discussed at that meeting potentially considering the actual MOA amendments tonight. And then I made the decision with Kate that given a lot of the kind of continuing back and forth that was occurring, some perhaps slight adjustments to what our understanding was, we just wouldn't have time to really understand what we were doing. And I thought in the long run, we're going to be better off taking our time, really getting into this document tonight, letting everybody kind of ask their questions and get their issues out on the table, and then potentially bringing this back in January. So Deputy Secretary Donahue is here. Again, he's going to be available along with Kate to kind of walk us through the MOA, the proposed changes. There are some issues I think that are still kind of outstanding. At the end of this discussion, you do see a resolution in your packet. And that resolution is essentially just signalizing that NVTC is supportive of the discussion that we're having with the Commonwealth on Long Bridge. It does not commit us to particular MOA changes or even commit us to the project, but it does signify that we are engaged in this discussion. And Nick can maybe speak to the reason for that resolution, but essentially it's ensuring that the Commonwealth isn't coming to the General Assembly in a few weeks with potential changes, and there having been sort of no record of this body kind of consenting to that, so that ensuring that we retain the collaborative approach that we have. So, Kate, why don't I kind of turn it over to you to get started?
In fact, and so what I plan on doing is going over elements of the current agreement and then highlighting the proposed changes with the help of Deputy Secretary Donahue. You do have the document in front of you. Where I'm going to start, though, is not line by line. I want to give some thematic overview of the agreement, and then I will be pointing to certain lines to help you sort of walk through what the changes are. But in general, this is a 40-year agreement between the Commonwealth Transportation Board, VDOT, and NVTC. And ever since its inception, we did the first. This is actually, we've already got, this is an amended document we're currently working with. We're talking about doing a second amendment. All along, this is about implementing the proposed transportation improvements that were identified by VDOT and DRBT in studies that were conducted during the McDonnell administration. And what they focused on was converting the existing I-66 inside the Beltway to dynamically priced toll lanes during rush hour, allowing transit and commuter buses to run for free at all times, permitting HOV2 to ride free until outside the Beltway hot lanes were open, at which time they convert over to HOV3, improving transit services, improving the facility by widening it during a certain portion of it. And really, this was focused on I-66 inside the Beltway as well as parallel corridors. So those are the fundamental things that we've seen ever since the very beginning of this agreement. As I mentioned, it was originally signed in 2015. It was amended in 2017 because the original amendment actually had a lot of discussion about widening I-66 inside the Beltway and a lot of conditions for that happening. Well, the Commonwealth actually found separate funds. Originally, they were actually going to be toll revenues used to do the widening. So that got removed. And so the basis of the agreement that we're currently working on is really focused, probably 90% of it is on what we now call our commuter choice program. Now, the goals of the program, which are articulated here and have been thematic throughout, are really about moving more people, enhancing transportation connectivity, improving transit service, reducing roadway congestion, and increasing travel options, again, for those who travel along that corridor. The MOA does articulate the roles of VDOT, CTB, and NVTC in the corridor. VDOT will and will continue to have a role administering all of the infrastructure associated with inside the Beltway. We would be administering a multimodal competitive program, and CTB would approve what NVTC selects and puts forward. Again, you've all been involved in this process with the Commuter Choice Program. The MOA did also mention, and we did already initiate an initial upfront payment of $10 million for projects that would start when tolling commenced, and that was actually our first program that moved forward. In here, we're going to talk a little bit about this later when it comes to amendments. It does set up the distribution of toll revenues, what I'm going to refer to as a waterfall, sort of priority of revenues. It does allow NVTC to issue debt, at least permissibility to do so. It does place limitations on the use of the funding for transit operations, and establishes an approval process for projects selected by NVTC. Getting a little bit more in the details because there's a lot of information within here. It does speak to VDOT's right to suspend tolls or continue tolling after the end of this term, and other things regarding their responsibility for maintaining and operating the facility. When it comes to CTB, their role is that they are to review and take NVTC's project lists and make sure that they're included in the annual budget process that VDOT, and actually we'll talk later, DRPT put forward. And that they will be responsible for working with the General Assembly and the appropriation of these funds. VDOT is responsible for sending us quarterly payments for the funding that's been approved for the projects. For NVTC, we are responsible, as I mentioned before, for proposing projects. There are specific requirements for that. These projects must benefit the toll payers of the corridor. They must have the capacity to obtain one or more of the improvement goals that I mentioned earlier. And they must be one of the following multimodal transportation improvements: new or enhanced local or commuter bus services, van pool and formal and informal carpooling, WMATA rail and bus capital or operating expenses, new or expansions to park and ride lots, roadway improvements for the corridor, including parallel routes, transportation demand management, ITS and other system management and operations improvements. And actually any project that's identified by the Commonwealth or in regional long-range transportation plans, again, starting with benefiting the toll payers. The projects that are selected for PAYGO funding must be obligated within 2 fiscal years of their selection, and the funding must be expended within 5 years. Again, these are conditions within the MOA. Obviously, the projects must be in compliance with all applicable laws, rules, and regulations. NVTC is bound by this the MOA and the provisions of Virginia Code related to the use of toll revenues. And we must, of course, provide documentation when requested by the Commonwealth and by USDOT. The key elements of the project selection process are already included in here, and these are the things that NVTC has been doing. We are to do a call for projects to all jurisdictions and public transportation providers in Planning District 8. We are to do evaluation, prioritization, and selection of projects, and we are to hold a public hearing. As I mentioned before, it does permit NVTC to use these funds to finance projects, but if we do so, that is under our risk, understanding that the changes in the revenue could affect that. So we would be liable for that debt. And also, if we did issue debt, it could not extend beyond the duration of the MOA, which sort of when that MOA expires, we could not have debt that goes beyond that. And this wrapping up the other details, we are required to monitor and report on the performance of the projects to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. We've actually already been doing that for the past 2 years. There's a bigger project after year 5. And then, like we do with most agreements, we have details on accounting, quality management, public information, regulatory approvals, contracting provisions, and insurance and indemnity of contractors. And finally, we have their sort of standard language when it comes to amendments, termination, and notices and actions. So that's pretty much the entire MOA, the way it's organized. Now, what's been proposed by the Commonwealth really focuses on about 3 or 4 different items. And this is where I actually will help point to where those are within this document. As was presented back to the Commission in December 2017, the Commonwealth does propose to use revenues for debt service and expenses for specific transit capital improvements that are going to be referred to as rail components, with a focus on Long Bridge and also allowing for improvements that would be related to Metro Rail passenger throughput at Roslyn. You actually would find there's both some definitional as well as the use of the tolls you would find in here. So basically, starting on page 3 on line 64, there's a definition of the scope of Long Bridge. and Roslyn improvements. I know this is actually what had been drafted for the commission 2 years ago. The intent in the language here was to be broad enough to cover those, especially for Roslyn, knowing that that has yet to be determined the specific capital improvements that would go on. So that's why it's written fairly flexible. And so I don't know if we want to.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so
Pause.
as we get into these
Yeah.
changes, why don't we kind of go item by item and allow folks to ask questions? I mean, I'll
Right.
tell you that on this issue, and I don't know if Mr. Meyer, if you want to chime in, but we had some discussion in the executive committee. One of the concerns that was raised is, and this was raised last month too, is our ability as a commission to potentially fund Roslyn improvements down the road. Essentially, first of all, whether this agreement structurally allows for it, and I think the answer is that it does, and in fact, that's kind of the intent here. But then from a commitment or financial standpoint, what sort of funding is left once we've committed essentially everything minus what the Commonwealth is kind of guaranteeing, which is we're gonna get to.
I was
But
gonna say, I'm just about to jump.
yeah, so is there anything else you want to say on
No,
that?
I think you captured the sentiment of our discussion, which was that we're all in on this. We're all focused on trying to get this Long Bridge done, which is commendable. But as soon as that's sort of put to bed, if we can do that, we're going to pivot to Roslyn. And my question was, we need to just be mindful that we don't use up all of our options on this project and then struggle to put together a package. It could be more vexing down the road. It's just an observation.
Mr. Lemon?
I have a question about just how the debt works generally. I've got some concerns about the Long Bridge, but maybe that's not for right now. If NVTC were to issue debt, does the project that the debt supports still have to go through the commuter choice program scoring process so that everybody can see how that project rates against other things that might just be funded with cash?
I think the answer is yes, but the NVTC issued debt would not be for Long Bridge. Right?
No, separate out from Long Bridge. I'm just
Yeah.
talking generically.
I think if NVTC is allowed to issue debt, I mean, that's not a change, right? Or
No,
is it?
no.
No, we already have that ability.
Any project that we would, whether it be
Yeah.
PAYGO or debt, would go through the evaluation
Right.
process.
We
Absolutely.
have not done that, but
Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that. Since you mentioned the Long Bridge Debt project, if we were to direct some of the toll money or allow it to be directed to service bonds for a project like the Long Bridge, does that project have to be scored according to the commuter choice program so we could see the bang for the buck that we would be getting for our money and compare it to other projects that might no longer be funded, for example?
so I think once, again, either one of you can step in here, but I think if we commit in an MOA to provide a portion of toll revenue for Long Bridge, then that money would have to be used to service that debt if it's issued or if it's PAYGO in the future. So I think the answer to that question is no. Is that,
As it's currently drafted, only the NVTC portion of this would go through that. I do believe.
Mr. Chairman,
Wow.
to Mr. Lemunion's questions, there are, with regard to NVTC debt, we had extensive discussions with your legal counsel and financial advisors.
yeah, you don't need to answer that question.
Okay. I think the question Mr. Lemunion is generically kind of raising is, do we have any idea whether or not the Long Bridge is a beneficial project? Because I guess to be direct, my understanding of what your scoring in the commuter choice program does is trying to understand whether or not this is a beneficial project. And so
In
just to be
comparison to other
as
choices.
clear as possible, if I may, there's been extensive studies of the Long Bridge project. We're in the middle of a draft environmental impact statement. Director Mitchell and her staff have also done extensive studies looking at the additional throughput of people through the corridor, Road 66 and others that we anticipate would take place if the Long Bridge were to be constructed. So I just want to be very clear for the record, there is extensive and will continue to be additional information regarding the impacts and benefits of that project.
But I think to directly answer your question, no, it would not then be subject to an annual evaluation because it's a commitment that's being made over a period of time.
Like just to pursue that, they're not so much concerned about the annual evaluation, but the initial decision. So if NVTC wants to take on debt and pay for it out of toll money, that's gotta run through commuter choice first. But if NVTC wants to take money and fund somebody else's debt, that project doesn't need to go through commuter choice, and I think that's a mistake.
Go ahead.
So the Commonwealth's agreement allows NVTC to get a portion of these revenues. So I'm not sure that, I mean, I defer to the Commonwealth, I think.
So this is outside of the community choice program,
Right.
essentially.
Okay, well, Nick hit it on the head, and I think to say that there's a distinction between, if you, it's the same toll money, it's
Mhm.
just who owns the bonds and who's running the project, and to say some projects have to go through and be rated and others don't, just because of the way the money gets flowed. I think that's a distinction without a difference and a real public policy failure. That's the way this group wants to go.
If I may, Mr. Chair, that this is not without precedent, because insofar as this MOA originally conceived that money from the tolls would be used to widen 66, that widening was not subject to an evaluation of its effective relief to tollpayers either. Certainly not
It wasn't
relative to
spent for
other
that either,
projects.
so maybe it should have, if the money went for that.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, if I might just go back to the history of this document, because this was kind of an unprecedented document at that time. These are tolls that were imposed by the Commonwealth pursuant to its authority under 33.2309. And under that document, the Commonwealth has a responsibility to ensure certain tests with regard to tolls are met when they are expended. As this document essentially takes the Commonwealth Transportation Board and, I'm struggling to find the correct word, but essentially delegates that selection authority to an outside entity. The reason those provisions are put in place is to ensure that the requirements of the Code of Virginia are met. If the Long Bridge project were to be advanced, it would be under a vote of the board who would make a similar determination. So I'm just not sure.
The vote of the
The
CTB.
CTB, correct.
Yeah.
So the CTB is the one who's imposed tolls, and always in every vote it takes must ensure compliance with that. Under this document, the reason to put those provisions in here with regard to the commission, as the person who helped write many of these provisions, was to ensure that the Code of Virginia was met with and to address concerns expressed by legislators at that time of whether or not this commission would follow the code.
Because ultimately, even with commuter choice, any of the project awards that we make have to go to the CTB.
Correct.
And we go through that process. Okay, why don't you keep going in this?
Absolutely.
We're
So the next element of this, and I think this is getting at the use of the toll revenue. So once again, I mentioned the waterfall. So the way this would play itself out is starts on page 5 with items B and then actually down to D. I will talk about the NVTC payment a little bit later. So this would allow for, when you go through what we call the waterfall of revenues, the first thing to be paid are the reasonable cost of managing the tolling infrastructure. Again, that's exactly what we have right now. A new thing would be added, which is debt service or rail components. So again, referencing back to debt service on either Long Bridge and or Roslyn. So definition of rail components is elsewhere. And then there would be a dedicated funding for NVTC that we can dive into a little bit. But below that would be funding available after that for PAYGO for rail components. And this is some language that we were provided by the Commonwealth last week to help do some startup construction funding until 2034. And I think it'd be very helpful to understand from the Commonwealth the two elements that are included in there and what they look like.
Go ahead, yes.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I was just waiting for your.
No, that's fine, fine. She did such a nice segue. I was just gonna letting you roll with it.
So as Ms. Matthijs mentioned, there are two additions here that are kind of highlighted. One deals with debt service rail components, and the other deals with pay-as-you-go funding for the rail components. This is a slightly different construct than what the Commonwealth originally approached the commission with in 2017. As we have worked to further refine and develop the Long Bridge financing plan, we've had additional discussions with the United States Department of Transportation, and in particular discussions with them regarding how the TIFIA loan program potentially would work, and should the commission ultimately be willing to enter into some amendments to this agreement, it is the Commonwealth's intent to explore the viability of using the TIFIA loan. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, that's a federally subsidized loan program that provides, to put it, generous financing terms with regard to help for infrastructure investment there. One of those financing terms is the deferral of payment of principal and interest for a number of years. And so in effect, the way I would ask you, which doesn't mean you have to agree with me, but it's what I would ask of you to think of as the pay-go components as essentially, since we have the ability to defer the debt service for a period of 5 and sometimes even longer years, and that is subject to negotiation. So it may or may not materialize depending on how those discussions go. And there is no agreement or document with USDOT, so I can't refer you to that. There would be, we could sell debt and then have a period of several years, again, 5 or longer, where there would be no debt to serve because of the terms of that TIFIA program. And in that event, what we would effectively like to do is take an amount of money that is substantially similar to what otherwise would be debt service and use that to help with the financing plan. Is that additional funding from the tolls for this? To be very direct, yes. Does it materially change the amount that would be available if we started servicing the debt in year 1? No, not really. Because if we weren't deferring the debt, we'd otherwise be paying the debt service. And so this is a result of our discussions and work over the last 2 years since we first approached the commission, finding ways to best maximize our ability to try and deliver this key regional project.
Try to ask a couple of clarifying questions. Is it a requirement of the TIFIA loan that we defer the payment down on the principal, or it's an option that we could exercise with the TIFIA loan?
It is the TIFIA loan program. If you want to pay earlier, I'm sure would always let you pay earlier. We were simply trying to maximize the financing viability.
Can certainly respect that. Is there a reason though that this needs to be in the waterfall, that the pay-go to take advantage of this opportunity would need to be prioritized ahead of other commuter choice projects?
Mr. Chair, Ms. Crystal, the pay-go is below the NVTC minimum payment, so it is not above that kind of base payment there. It's actually, I believe, proposed as D, and the payment would be C there, and so it is after that there in the waterfall.
Thank you.
What does that mean exactly, though?
So what that would mean is, say we need the debt service being above the payment, and we have some information that we can develop because of coverage ratios, that there's more than sufficient revenue to make the NVTC payment. So we'll be very clear about that. What that means is if we sell debt through the TIFIA program and we do defer the repayments, which again, to be very direct, every time we've done TIFIA debt, we've deferred the payment.
Yeah.
So
And we do that on several lines as a
Yeah,
fair fact.
I just don't, I want to make sure I'm clear that it's not some outside potential if we do move forward. It is the more likely outcome.
Yeah.
What that would mean for all intents in the waterfall is we would pay for the tolling O&M. There would be no debt service at that stage, so you would skip B. The payment would go to NVTC based on the guidelines laid out, and I forget the name of the exhibit, but it's back in here where Kate has inflated the amount by the 2.5% going out. Then an amount, which again we would work and disclose to the commission, would be used for rail pay-go, and then the remaining buckets, if whatever was left, would have flowed through them.
Flow through who?
Any remaining funding at that point would then flow through the remaining portions of the waterfall, which involve repayment to the toll facilities revolving account, and then also at some point back to NVTC as well.
Well, that's what I was getting at.
Yes. Oh, sorry, sir. Yes. Back to the commission.
Back to the commission. Okay. I don't know if that could address the concern about Rosalind, but it's probably not enough.
If I could have your indulgence.
Yes.
So again, I can't speculate as to what interest rates or other things will be, or whether toll revenues will meet expectations or other things of that nature, or whether toll policy is changed by those who have the power to do so. What I would say is, in our analysis of the potential financing runs, when we start servicing debt, we provide the commission with your annual payment. After several years, there are residual revenues that are in place. I don't know the timing of when any potential Rosalind project might be. Mr. Dorsey informed me of some things that had taken place with the Amada board at the last meeting I was not fully aware of. So again, the timing of that as an unknown, depending on when that comes to bear and when that is, there could be opportunities, one, to see whether or not with the residual at that time, which would be in excess of the minimum coverage, could be available to, issue some additional debt. Or the TIFIA program does also have the ability to refinance debt. When doing so, creates additional financing capacity out of that revenue stream. And again, to be as clear as possible, in case anyone in here has a friend at the Build America Bureau, I am not saying they would agree to that. I am saying the federal code allows that to take place. So again, I'm not trying to say, oh yeah, we're gonna go in there, they'll be like, we love you guys, Virginia, let's do it. What I'm saying is, if there's a way to do it, the revenue stream appears that it would have some capacity. I want to be very clear, Mr. Chairman, I don't know what that is. And I don't know whether the TIFIA program would let us re-benchmark out to the same term, or whether they would ask us to stay within the same term. Those are all things that we would have to explore. And again, I'm not saying that it would provide the amount of money you might like for a Roslyn improvement or other things of that nature. So I'm not trying to
Yeah, I understand.
overpromise and say this is going to be great. What I'm trying to say is there are opportunities, depending on the performance of the road and the timing of that project, that could be available.
So I raised this with you earlier and when we spoke, and I don't anticipate you probably would have anything new to say yet on it, but I did raise the specter of, should we go down this road and then at some point in the future, the legality because of Meeks or somewhat is challenged and for some reason is successful, then what happens? Because how far obligated do we become? And I did raise the question of potentially a bond validation suit up front to sort of deal with that issue. So I don't know if you have anything more to say about it, but I did want to raise it again because I continue to think that that might be a smart approach.
Understood, Mr. Chairman. So several points that I would make. The first is, again, I'm the Deputy Secretary of Transportation. That word deputy means I'm not in charge. And those who are above me, I assure you, would not have let me come to this commission in 2017, last month, or this month if we were unsure of our ability and the legality of the proposal we were put forth before you. At this point,
I believe that you believe it is entirely legal. That is not a question.
Yeah, I cannot state whether or not we ultimately would pursue a bond validation suit. Again, we have extreme confidence in that. And so again, that's something I'm happy to bring back to the folks that don't have deputy before their title and have discussions with there. Ultimately, as was noted at the last meeting, if the debt is sold, it would be sold by the Commonwealth. The risk relative to that debt would either reside with the Commonwealth or the bondholders with regard to how the covenants were originally structured there. And so if someone were to challenge us in the event we determine or decide not to do a bond validation suit, there would be no risk to the commission. The risk would be either to the bondholders or to the Commonwealth. Similarly, the risk then is on how that debt is defeased or paid off. It has no relationship to the constitutionality of the imposition of tolls on I-66. So the commuter choice program similarly should remain unaffected. The issue that would be at risk is the Commonwealth itself now on the hook to defease debt,
right,
or are the bondholders on the hook because they're concerned because the covenants did not protect them in that instance? In either instance, that should not impact the commuter choice program.
You're right. My concern perhaps wasn't so much for the commuter choice program. It was for, in the event the Commonwealth is now on the hook for this amount of money, where does that get that money from? And I have a kind of a suspicion that it's going to end up flowing back to Northern Virginia in some way or other. But I know you can't say that. We don't know that.
I could not speculate
I
in
know.
any way, shape,
I
or
know.
form, and I suspect I would not be there at that time if that were to happen in that unlikely circumstance.
Hope none of us are. Mr. Vargas.
Just a quick question. It seems as though the legal exposure is probably minimized by what I'm hearing, but there is a financial exposure. I'm more concerned about the public perception exposure. I mean, the folks that pay the toll inside the Beltway for 66 coming from Prince William, coming from Loudoun, coming from Western Fairfax, making sure that we're prepared at that time to be able to talk about the direct benefit of Long Bridge and other programs to those toll payers as we get to that. So the messaging has to be very clear and very crisp in terms of why it is that it's important that we fund and pay for Long Bridge as they continue to pay tolls on 66 inside the Beltway.
I haven't found that, but Mr. Lamagna.
Well, further to that point, it's not only the benefit, clearly BRE would benefit from a bridge. Question
Would
is,
Loudoun and
how do you
Fairfax.
pay for it?
Right.
Okay, and I think what's unfortunate about what's been proposed by the state is it creates winners and losers among commuters in Northern Virginia. And I think the people in Northern Virginia deserve better public policy than that. We ought to go back and come up with a win-win solution. We shouldn't be funding VRE at the expense of all the other things that will not get funded for the next 35 years, if that's how long the bonds are. The because we're siphoning half or more of the money from the I-66 toll that could have gone to these other projects that are going to benefit other people in Northern Virginia, especially if we're going to get another $1.5 million like someone recently said we were going to get. So we can talk about the benefits to VRE, but right next door to that, and very upfront in public, has got to be the downside, what people are going to lose that they thought they were going to get from this toll.
So I do think one way potentially to address this, and I really didn't intend to come forward with a lot of this tonight in this meeting, but I did mention the executive committee meeting, is through the community choice program itself and how the money is divvied up. Because I actually share the concern that Western Fairfax and Loudoun users who make up a unknown percentage, but likely, I think, significant percentage of the toll payers are not going to see the level of direct benefit that those who actually are on the VRE line will see. So pretty much anybody, from Wolf Trap on west is not, VRE is not accessible to them. They will see a benefit by virtue of the fact potentially that there are fewer vehicles on 66 coming from other places, but it will not be the same level of benefit for the amount that's being invested. So I think that there may be a way to address that inside commuter choice by essentially setting aside or designating a certain percentage of that remaining money for that corridor. Perhaps not in a rigid way, but in a way that we do at NVTA, where there's sort of an assumption that something in that particular corridor, defined as Dulles Toll Road corridor up to the Greenway, there be ensuring that there's money available for projects in that area. That's one way to address it. So, yeah, Mr. Snyder.
Thanks. I'd like to follow up on that. I think not only are you disadvantaged, but we are as well. We've already suffered traffic diversion. We're facing an increased HOV3. Our people pay the tolls. We have this small pot of money that we're eligible for, and we know we're guaranteed that this is going to be reduced. And we get absolutely no benefit from VRE and no benefit from the Long Bridge. So your fix may take care of a small portion, but doesn't at all take care of the unfairness inherent in this proposal. So I just wanted to make that comment as well.
Mr. Scott.
At the risk of violating Sam Rayburn's quote of everything's been said, but not everybody has said it. I look at this project, it's more an editorial comment than anything, as a regional priority. We as a region have talked about it for a very long time. There are definite benefits to the project, and I understand we can sit and there's concerns that have been expressed, but there's clearly a need for increased capacity, and by putting resources into increasing that capacity for VRE, I think the entire ecosystem, our transportation ecosystem, benefits. So, I certainly understand the concerns, especially from folks out in Western Loudoun and whatnot, but it does seem through all the conversations and all the studies and analyses that have been done, this is a necessary project. And I think we as a body and as a region need to figure out a way to do it. This is obviously one option that's been put before us and one that seems to be reasonable.
This time an unprecedented partnership where the CTV would impose tolls and then give the revenues to a regional entity to select projects.
But that was also when the revenue was anticipated to be used to widen 66, right?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes.
So that 7 million was in addition to the widening?
After you sold debt for the
Yeah.
widening, it was
Yeah.
anticipated that there would be
Okay.
5 to 7.
Well, so, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
So just other elements of the payment, we did talk briefly about the payment, but there's a couple other things that are not in here that would be anticipated included in the drafting, and I'll have Nick confirm these. Right now, what's in here right now is a discussion of a 10 million a year plus an escalation from inside the Beltway. Currently not included in this draft, but is anticipated to add in future draft, is that there would be an additional 5 million provided from outside the Beltway revenues. So there would be a 15 million a year plus a 2.5 escalation. The other thing that is missing, at least technically, although we've talked about
Wait,
it.
where are you exactly?
Oh,
Sorry.
Now, I'm actually just on B, on page 5.
Oh, you're still,
I'm
okay.
at C. Just want to make sure people understood the payment.
Yeah, okay.
Because the other part, so the part of it is there's a 5 million that's missing. That's not in this document. There's no reference to that. And
Mr.
confirm.
Chairman, I would confirm Ms. Mattias's point that that is something we simply, after you and I spoke and we understood the potential timing of any consideration, we haven't written that language, but it is our full intent, working with Director Mitchell and others, to include provisions in this document with regard to the I-66 outside the Beltway transit payments and providing $5 million escalating at 2.5% a year if the Commonwealth moves forward with the rail components for that.
Well, and on that 5 million specifically, I think the outstanding question is whether that money has to be used outside the Beltway or whether it can be combined with the inside the Beltway money. Or whether it should be. That's another question that could be a inside I-66 community choice question, but.
Mr. Chairman, what I would say is every project has to be judged on its merits, on its face. As we know, many people who start driving outside the Beltway continue to drive inside the Beltway. And we have many studies to kind of back up that fact. So I believe there are many projects that even if they only say they do not directly go to outside, but they have benefits inside, we know those are the same toll paying users in many instances. And so I believe there would be an opportunity there. We would need to do some work, working with Ms. Mattias and others to put in place some of that information. But I also would stress that every project is unique. And there are projects that could be inside the Beltway today with inside the Beltway money that may not pass the test. And there are projects that could be funded with that money that might be exclusively outside the Beltway that might not pass the kind of the Meeks test. So again, I just stress every project is subject to its own unique and independent review.
Is there any possibility of actually getting data for where the toll users are actually coming from? Because anything I've seen, the only numbers that we seem to have were actually pre-tolling and they were sort of, state level estimates, but not
And
actual.
we get figures on where users are coming from.
Yeah, like where the toll payers are coming from. So that keeps coming up in this conversation.
And I'm sorry, and just to be extremely clear, the information could get correctly would be a mix of toll payers and carpoolers. It
Okay,
would be users.
users, all right,
System. That's why I
fair,
was trying to draw that distinction. Sorry, I apologize.
that's fine. But is that information that you have?
I do not have that with me. It's information I could ask someone to compile.
I think that might be helpful for this discussion on a lot of levels.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I'm trying to reserve the balance of my comments for the conclusion of the conversation, but I think we've sort of lost the thread of what this program is designed to offer, which is benefit not to the people of jurisdictions from which drivers on 66 come, but relief to the toll payer. Relief to the toll payer is delivered when there are fewer cars on 66. It doesn't matter where those trips originate or even where the trip of the driver originate if the tolls are lower because there are fewer drivers.
It matters who the toll payers are, though. You can't say that this is for relief to the toll payer and then we don't know who the toll payers are.
But relief comes in the form of either transit alternatives or a lower
Mhm.
toll. And so people benefit from a lower toll on 66 when there are fewer drivers on 66. It doesn't matter where the point of the origination of the driver that is now no longer on 66.
But even to the point about outside the Beltway funding, I think there's a question about whether the outside the Beltway money can be used inside the Beltway, first of all. And then if it can be used, if it should be.
That's a fair question. I know less about the
Yeah.
outside the Beltway strictures.
Well, that's actually why I was asking the
Okay,
question.
but I
Because
think it's important because this conversation has come up again and again about our program, our commuter choice program,
Mhm.
which is about relief to the toll payer, not about what jurisdiction those toll payers originate in. And I think we run a tremendous risk to our regionally focused program if we try to make this a tit for tat about where individual projects and in which jurisdiction they are. If we are getting fewer drivers off 66 and tolls are therefore lower, we are fulfilling the mission of our program.
Yes.
Thank you. I associate myself with Ms. Crystal's brilliant remarks, and I don't say that casually. I think when we're thinking about data, it's not really so much about where the toll payers are coming from, but it's actually where they're going throughout the corridor. That's the critical piece so that we can understand what are the kinds of projects, wherever they originate, that will actually provide relief. And so, one of the things that I think would be a public policy failure would be if we ever got to a point where we're thinking about allocating money for projects based on someone's jurisdiction, but really about their impact through the corridor. So whatever data it takes to allow us to make those good decisions, I think is well worth our time.
Hence the message.
Problem with this.
Supervisor Meyer, go
Well, I was gonna say, the problem with that is it falls back to Jim's point, that you need to score this project against the others. And I don't think you can do that in bond, right? That's really fundamentally the issue, is that if we think that it should just be whatever moves the most people, per dollar, I think arguably that might not be necessarily the Long Bridge project, right? But the question becomes, is this so important to the region? And does it, yes, move some cars off of the 66 corridor that we ought to do this? And that's really the question. And further, the question is, do we really want to limit ourselves from never reforming the I-66 to ever lower them again? And I know the outside of this Beltway contract can limit that as well. But those are all tough questions for the next commission.
Okay, Kate, do you wanna keep going?
Sure, I don't know, did Director Mitchell have
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I just for a point of comparison, our studies show that with the additional VRE ridership that we could have with this and getting VRE to 15-minute headways, we can essentially more than double the VRE ridership from 1,900 people a day on the Manassas line to about 4,000 people a day. And those are people that many of which would otherwise be in the 66 corridor. And while I really don't even want to speculate about how something like this would score in the commuter choice process, I do want to remind you all, though, that this is an asset with a 100-year life. And we have already talked about adding an annualization factor to the scoring for these projects to reflect projects that have a longer shelf life. The current Long Bridge is only 115 years old, but we think will at least have a 100-year life. So just another thing to consider too. This is a long-lasting asset.
So the other two things I want to mention, one of which is something that I know that this commission and the jurisdiction are very interested in, is some relief on what currently exists as a cap how long we can pay for the operations of transit projects that are actually performing along the corridor. So currently, even if we have a bus service or what have you doing very, very well, comes back and competes, we actually can only fund the operations of it 100% for the first 5 years, and then that's stepping down. And so what is being proposed here is actually would mirror what we do in I-395, which I think was quite a victory for the commission, which is pretty much as long as the commission is evaluating those projects, they come back every so many years and they're performing, we as a commission can decide how we want to provide the operating assistance. It's not something that's dictated by the jurisdiction. The conditions on that, if you do look at the language, which happens to be on page 8, starting at line 228, may look a little bit confusing because one of the provisions that we had from 395 that we're proposing to move over is that if there's a project that literally is within, doesn't touch a metro station or VRE, and doesn't cross a jurisdiction, then perhaps that is something that should be over time the responsibility of the locality to pay for. In most instances, I think almost every single project that we've funded so far is crossing a jurisdiction, if not leading to a metro station. So it'd be very rare, but there is sort of a relief valve for that in there. So that would be relief that our folks would see within the commuter choice program. And then finally, as you see, I've highlighted certain things. There's lots of other red stuff in here. We've been working with DRPT to do some technical amendments that align this better. Because we're administering the commuter choice program nearly identically for 395 and 66. Right now, DRPT is not even a party to this agreement, but yet we deal with DRPT on this on a daily basis. They're the ones helping us present to CTV. So there's a lot of things related to DRPT and putting them in here and some reporting requirements that would be consistent. The other thing we have is there were just some technical cleanup, some places where words were used in duplicate. So we're looking at doing some cleanup and things like that. I will promise you, though, there are likely still either typos or other editing things that we need to go through and make sure references are checked and all that kind of stuff. So I do appreciate being kind if you're one that likes to go line by line, because this was not ready for prime time. This was intended to get at sort of the 25,000 foot level for all of you. And so that is what I have to present. And if I may, I just need to correct something I just said. Nick reminded me, I got my numbers mixed up. The ridership that we're talking about is actually 1.9 million annually for VRE.
going up to 4 million annually. And so that's, but it is over, I apologize, I mixed up with daily, but it is actually more than doubling the ridership that we would see here on this line.
Okay. Mr. Lemonnier.
Well, to Jennifer's point, I'm just sort of thinking off the top of my head here. 4 million passengers a year on the Manassas line. If they were to be charged an additional $2 or $3 a ticket, that's 8 to 12 million a year. That's what the state's asking NVTC to turn over to help fund the bonds. Why not just raise the price a little bit on the tickets on the Manassas line and cover it that way? You don't have to bother NVTC.
Let them after that.
Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Lemonion's point, the state is currently working to develop a financing plan for the Long Bridge project. And by working, I mean, we've been doing a lot of work. We still have some work to do. Obviously, our discussions here are part of that work moving forward. We do anticipate this to be a diversified funding stream. There will be state revenues in there and to be direct. We have been working with DRPT to take every dollar they essentially have available for rail for a very long time and putting it towards this project just to make sure that we could clearly show to everyone across the state this was a priority rail project. We're not holding anything back at the state level. We are also working with the federal government. We anticipate at least 2/3 of the funding for this project would come from sources directly under the control of the state or that the state has obtained from the federal government there. We are working with Virginia Railway Express to explore the extent to which the commuter rail operating and capital fund, which is
So
established.
pause there, Ms. Crystal, on behalf of VRE, do you want to make a comment on that?
I do want to make a comment on that. So we will be finalizing VRE's role in this financing package at a meeting later this month, but we anticipate it'll be on the order of $12 or $13 million a year. So very consistent with what you're saying. I think that it makes more sense for us to do that out of our capital funding because it is a capital project rather than to further raise fares on riders. As we talk about often with Metro, there is a relationship between the number of riders you can induce to take your system and the fare rate. And so I think we want to make sure that those don't work at cross purposes. But VRE absolutely recognizes that there is a role for the operations board rather recognizes that there's a funding role for the VRE.
Okay. How many people aren't going to be riding transit over the next 35 years because $300 million that this organization could spend on transit's going somewhere else? And that's, nobody's looking at the downside, it's all at the upside.
I think we're here to have a debate about the up and the
The
downside.
common
I mean,
sense public policy approach is for the people who get the most benefit, pay the cost. Okay, and you really got to stretch, law aside, you really got to stretch to say the VRE is going to take cars off of 66.
I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay.
I think Director Mitchell actually.
All right, hold on. We'll go to Mr. Skiles next.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to respond back, we are taking money from transit and putting it into a transit project. And I guess in a perfect world, if we knew what the future transit projects are, we could make that value judgment, but we don't. So we know this project is a regional priority. We know that VRE is an incredibly successful transit system. We want it to continue to be a successful transit system. And, you know, so I guess looking at it in that lens, and I understand what you're saying, Jim, I certainly sympathize with some of the points you made, but when you look at it through that lens, it seems to me that it makes sense for this organization, which is dedicated to enhancing transit in the region, would be putting this into arguably one of the most important projects from a regional standpoint.
I don't want to do anything close to disparage what we've done with commuter choice. But the reality is they are mostly projects that local governments have put forward that they are already funding or would be funding themselves. So we've really just shifting money around a little bit with the projects that we funded with commuter choice. Now, I think some of the changes.
Anyway.
What's that?
Get rid of the toll, then we don't really need it.
Well, that's a whole other discussion, and that, but
The road is
but-
turned to an HOV only facility.
correct, yes. But the point is, I get your point, but we are, the projects that we funded, I mean, I think the last round we funded an office at the Pentagon. I mean, again, but they are not things that are moving dramatic numbers of things around the way that this would. So I take your point. My concern is more just about making sure that the toll payer actually sees the benefit, which is why I was saying to Katie, I think actually seeing the 66 data may prove the point. I don't know, but it would be good to have it regardless. So, all right, who else wants to, yes?
Let me just weigh in on the Long Bridge. This is not just about replacing a bridge or improving a bridge. It is a game changer. And will go beyond just providing the ability for the VRE to have more passengers. It will ultimately open up, the opportunity for more commuter rail, more rail throughout the entire region. It's not just going to benefit, a small number of people, but this is a game changer. And I appreciate the state, I appreciate DRPT looking for ways to be able to pull and cobble together funding from various sources to be able to pull it off, including funding from the state, major funding from the state for rail, and not taking away from other sources, but putting more rail dollars from the state into this project. But we all kind of need to work together to make it happen, because it's going to make ultimately a major difference in transportation, rail transportation in the region.
So I guess, what sort of outstanding issues do we have, just from an information standpoint, as we think about actual MOU amendments in January?
So we do need to work with the Commonwealth on language for the outside the Beltway payment that would come in. We do need to tighten up language about understanding, because one thing that is not in the waterfall is actually, after everything else, the remainder goes to NVTC. The intent is there, we're literally just missing the language on that. So that needs to get in there. Obviously, technical edits and those sorts of things. And then, of course, if it's the direction of the commission to be looking at how in the evaluation process, we do something that's geographic distribution or something like that, how that plays itself out, whether that's in the MOA or if that's within the policies that the commission adopts, because we do adopt policies every year when we do a call for projects. So that's, that is it. Obviously, it's assuming that the commission is satisfied with the information that they're getting from the Commonwealth to make that decision.
Okay,
So, Mr. Chairman?
yes,
So we have a resolution,
we do.
number 2396, that resolves that NVTC supports ongoing discussion with the Commonwealth to amend the 2017 amended and restated Transform 66 inside the Beltway project memorandum of agreement to permit the use of a share of revenue for financing and pay-go for rail components related to Long Bridge. Now therefore be it resolved that the results of this discussion, which we've just had, in the form of a second amendment, blah, 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 be provided to the commission for consideration at a future meeting. So more to come for a future commission and members to roll up their sleeves
Second.
and agree to.
Are you making a motion, Chair?
That is a motion.
Okay, and it's seconded by Mr. McKay. Any discussion on that? Okay, so I don't know, Nick, if you just want to take a second and explain why we're doing this resolution. It was something we talked about.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, I'm here and we've been here and we were having these discussions because the Commonwealth takes extremely seriously the relationship that was formed in this document and is also replicated in the 395 agreement that we have with you all. We believe there is a unique opportunity that will be coming in the next, 12 months or so to potentially put in place a deal to build a publicly owned Long Bridge and guarantee perpetual increases in train service for VRE along this corridor. And just for those of you who are on the VRE operations board, today you're actually living year by year. Like those agreements with CSX are annual and they've actually been extended because of an inability to reach broader term agreements here. So we think there are opportunities to once see increases in service, but also the guarantee of that service being permanent and perpetual service kind of moving forward. Opportunities do have endpoints to them. The Commonwealth would like to move forward this session with legislation that would authorize this debt. However, we do respect this agreement and we don't want to move forward with language. And again, there's a whole nother debate that I'm sure we will have with the General Assembly about that legislation if it is introduced there, but we would like to have some indication from this commission, understanding there are still details to be worked out, and to Ms. Mattias's point, missing components that we fully intend to put in here. But some indications from the commission that in general, finding a way to try and support the Long Bridge project with 66 toll revenues is not outside of the realm of the discussions that we are having. So, because we do not want to create a precedent or the concept that the state would be moving forward without working with this commission with legislation that has implications for this agreement.
Okay, so Mr. Faust first.
Not sure that I fully understood what you just said, Nick, but my understanding is we're passing a resolution that says we're going to continue to talk to you. Not that we're sending messages that we're prepared to enter into a deal or anything else. It's just that we're continuing.
Understood.
Mr. Stein.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. My negative vote will be based, it is not a vote against the Long Bridge project, but it is a vote against funding the Long Bridge project in part in this way.
Okay.
Chairman,
Senator Black.
I guess looking at it from the standpoint of Loudoun County, Prince William County, I don't see where our voters gain anything from it. I recall a long time ago when I was first elected, the word was that once the Dulles Toll Road had paid for itself, it was going to be toll-free. And now it has become a grab bag for every scheme under the sun. Anything somebody can cook up is going to be paid for by the commuters on that toll road. And I just, I can't see where it has a benefit. And I think if we vote in favor of studying it, we're voting in favor of making it happen. And so that's the reason for my vote no.
Any other comments? Mr. Fuss, we already.
I am going to support the resolution, but my concern is similar in a way, and that is that sending a message to Richmond, to a brand new legislature that's going to undoubtedly be looking at transportation funding, that, hey, maybe there's a way out of their, the requirement to fund this, use existing funding that exists that NVTC controls. So we need new funding for transportation. We got to quit moving the shell around. We did it with the MBTA to fund Metro. Now we're going to do it with NVTC funds to fund Long Bridge. And I think you need to deliver the message, not that we're ready to write a check, but that, we may not write a check. The state has got to come up with some new funding sources for transportation.
Here.
Yeah.
I'm happy.
Okay, you hear that.
And Mr.
Take it. So I would say at a minimum, I would like to wait until the legislature has, until we're certain that they're not going to step up before we even continue the discussion.
Commissioner, we are doing an ongoing revenue sustainability study. There was a meeting that will take place next Thursday that is addressing just this issue. We have a very troubling trend in the Commonwealth for last year for the first time ever. Driving went up, and fuel tax collections went down. That's never happened. We've had both go down and both go up. So now we're having usage of our system go up, and the revenues related to people, what they pay to use it, is going down. And again, that means people have more fuel efficient cars and other things. Great for the environment, great for their pocketbooks, really, really bad for building and maintaining the infrastructure that they use. And so I hope I'm not giving anyone the impression that at the state, we're not acutely aware of that. It's something I spend a ton of time on, and we continue to make the point to many members of the General Assembly there, and who knows what discussions may happen there. But there are some other, absolutely, where are you?
Okay, that's for reminding of this
I
comment.
just associate myself with the comments from Mr. Snyder. I'm all for the Long Bridge. I'm against this win-lose approach of trying to fund it. I think that's unfortunate. I think we ought to go back to the table and come up with a win-win approach. And maybe if we thought a little harder, we could. I don't agree that this is a resolution that's just there to continue a conversation. If that's all we're doing, we don't need a resolution. this will be interpreted, no matter how anybody feels about it in the room or what you might think you're voting on, this will be interpreted by legislators in Richmond that this body is ready to concede all but 10 million a year of the toll money. That's the way it'll be perceived, regardless of whether you think that's what the words say. So you're getting ready to get on a slippery slope to a destination I think is going to be problematic in the end.
Okay.
Similar comments. I supportive of the Long Bridge. I'm supportive of finding creative ways to be able to fund it. I'm not sure if there's a need for a resolution at this point. So we've been talking. I think the talking is good. I think it's yielding good benefits and getting closer to where we need to be. I just don't need to. I don't know if we need a resolution to say let's keep talking.
Okay, well, a couple things for me. I think what Nick was saying, perhaps too eloquently, because I'm not sure it quite landed, was he didn't want to come down and have the Commonwealth have legislation introduced, changing an MOA with NVTC without some indication that NVTC is part of the conversation and even supportive of having the conversation. That's really what it comes down to. And it's more an issue of timing and sequence. And
Thank
so
you, Mr. Chairman, for saying that more clearly.
I appreciated that sentiment, honestly, because I think there was a sensitivity there to having a bill get dropped that changes our agreement without us having taken any action. So that is number one, why I do think there is a resolution and why there's one in our agenda. Number two, as to the base of the issue, I have some of the concerns, you've heard them. I understand the point about the regionalism of this project, and that's why ultimately I'm supportive of what we're trying to do. I also think sometimes it's a little easier to say these things when you don't have a lot of constituents that are paying 35 bucks a day in tolls. And those of us that do are very sensitive to having to go back to those commuters and justifying how the toll money is being spent. And there's already a perception out there that they're not seeing a benefit. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, it's absolutely true that a lot of these jurisdictions have not submitted a lot of projects that are addressing those areas. And some have, some haven't, and the ones that have gotten funded. So I think overall, we probably as a region need to do a better job with that and addressing particularly folks who are paying a lot in tolls. And in Loudoun, being blunt, those of us who have the Greenway, which nobody else has, are paying an extra $14 a day on top of $267, which is escalating in 66. And so there is a wariness out there, and it's a completely bipartisan issue, to this. And it requires a certain sensitivity if you represent those areas about how that money's being spent. And I'm not implying no one else has that. I know you do. I'm just saying. So I need to get around that a little bit. I need to think more about how to deal with that, especially as it relates to 66 inside the Beltway. That said, Long Bridge is a project that, unlike the 66 inside the Beltway projects, cannot be done by a jurisdiction. It requires some big sort of conglomerate to do it like this. And I'm generally in favor of the concept of us being part of that. So I'm going to support the resolution that's in here tonight. Mr. Meyer.
So I'll echo a little bit of that sentiment. I think we have to support the discussion ongoing. If it's 35-year loan that we take, and we're 10 million per year, 350 million isn't going to fund a multi-billion-dollar project. It's part of it, and it's going to be part of what they're going to have to do to find the money to do this. It does actually help a lot of folks in Prince William. We have one representative from Prince William, and nobody else here officially representing them. But it's going to take. I've talked to people who get off the VRE, and if we did a big VRE extension further into Prince William, into Haymarket, this could be game changing, and this would allow the capacity for it. If we don't have the Long Bridge, you're never going to get the VRE to Haymarket. Right, and that would be a game-changing project for I-60. And so it's with those sorts of things in mind that I think we have to continue the conversation. I agree with a lot of what Chairman Letourneau said earlier, that I do think there is some sensitivity as to who is actually paying the tolls and making sure that those who are paying the tolls are seeing the benefit. I don't think that those conversations are mutually exclusive. I think that there's a little bit to be said if certain jurisdictions, not jurisdictions, but a certain amount of drivers are paying those tolls to make sure they're getting benefited. But this project, if it does exactly what Director Mitchell says it does, which is going to take thousands of cars per day off of 66, to be honest, that does benefit Loudoun. It does benefit Fairfax. It does benefit Prince William. And so, my bigger concern overarching is that we're locking ourselves into high tolls for 35 years, right? And so what I want to make sure is that NVTC realizes as we commit the money here and as we look at committing money to Roslyn, that means you're telling people indefinitely that we're going to have pretty significant tolls on this corridor for the longest period of time. That's where my biggest concern lies, right? But I'm gonna support Jack Blackout.
Okay, any other comments on it then? All in favor of the resolution, say aye. Anyone opposed?
Opposed?
Okay, just go ahead and raise your hand. I want to make sure we're getting these recorded. Okay,
I have four.
four. And any abstain? Okay, so the motion carries. Do you have a vote?
Do you have a number on that? I have my votes.
Just-
Do you have a number of ayes?
Whoever else is.
Now, just trying to record the actual vote, that's all.
Do you need a number?
I would prefer one, but
Okay, hold on.
Show of hands?
it's just minus 4. Okay, 15? Okay, so 15 yes, 4 no. Okay, motion carries. All right, thank you for coming back. Appreciate the dialogue, and I suspect we'll be seeing you again in about a month.
Yes, and we'll be working with Ms. McTice in the interim to clean up this document and work on some of the other data requests that we received this evening. Thank you again for your time and indulgence.
Okay. So we're going to transition over to our WMATA discussion. The NVTC WMATA committee did not meet in November. However, there is a committee meeting December 18th. So I don't know if Chair Hutchins, do you want to make any final remarks as chair of the WMATA committee?
Well, I think the importance of our discussion on the FY21 budget is going to be critical to us, and knowing the funding that we all need to have at WMATA. I wish you all luck in following through in January.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Okay, so report from our Virginia WMATA board members. Mr. Smedberg, Mr. Dorsey, the floor is yours.
Christian's going to start out.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Smedberg. So we do have WMATA, a board meeting next week, as well as some committee meetings. This is a hiatus week, which we are certainly thankful for. And we're going to have a work session on the proposed capital budget and to authorize the public hearing, what we call the docket, on the FY21 budget. And that will include the scope of all the manner of things which have been proposed and need to be considered that could be implemented as part of the FY21 operating budget. And as Ms. Hudgens mentioned, we will be having a WMATA committee meeting the last of the year, next 2 weeks from now, right? Yes, 2 weeks from now on December 18th. And the substance of what we talk about there will be the budget, which we as a commission will be able to consider with a letter to WMATA sometime in January. In terms of the changes that have been proposed as part of the budget, on the bus side, there have been significant changes that have been proposed by the general manager, which jurisdiction staff and I think Mr. Smedberg and myself are really digging into because they are substantial. They include some changes that are designed to deal with unproductive routes and adjusting them to improve their efficiency. Could involve restructuring service, eliminating some redundant service, or it could mean making other adjustments to essentially make inefficient routes more productive. Then there's also, on the flip side, some service enhancements to Metro Bus, which are being proposed, particularly for weekend bus service, as well as on some high-performing routes that travel along transit corridors and into the District of Columbia. We are just wrapping our head around that substantial body of work on those bus changes. If history is any guide, they will cause significant conversation because, you know, as with anything, even if you have an unproductive bus route, it's got some people who rely on it potentially for very critical needs. So these are always very challenging things to execute and work through, and we'll be digging into it. Last month at this meeting, I talked a little bit about the Metro Rail service hours. Just to remind everyone, the general manager is proposing adding 4 hours back into the system service by adding a half an hour for each of the weekday periods to conclude service at 12 midnight, and then an hour adding into service to close the system at 2 a.m. on both Friday and Saturday. And because that is very much tied into Metro's maintenance schedule, we have asked that the Metro Rail Safety Commission weigh in as soon as it is practicable for them as to whether or not they have any concerns with that proposal. We'd rather not get too far into that process without knowing what our safety oversight entity thinks about that. Turn the rest over to Mr. Smedberg.
Okay, picking up where Christian left off, a few other key areas we want to highlight. So the proposed budget would increase the amount riders pay for peak rail service. The rush hour peak fare would rise by 10 cents. So riders entering the system would pay a base fare of $2.35. The maximum peak fare for a trip would also increase by $1, so riders could pay a maximum of $7. The proposed budget also includes a $2 weekend flat fare proposal. As a reminder, weekends are currently considered off-peak, so right now, the base rail fare is $2 and the maximum fare is $3.85. The budget also includes a 25-cent surcharge for Metro bus trips that use cash or onboard cash loading of a Smart Trip card. There would be no charge to the current $2 Metro bus fare for those who use a Smart Trip card. The proposed budget also includes a full transfer discount between Metro bus and Metro rail. The current transfer discount for Metro bus is 50 cents, and that proposal would increase that to $2. From a customer standpoint, this proposal would mean free transfers between Metro rail and regular Metro bus routes and vice versa. Jurisdictional staff have convened or have conveyed to us a strong desire for parity in transfer policy between the local transit and the Metro rail system. And we have asked WMATA to explore the policy and revenue implications of this. Last year, the WMATA board added Metro bus to rail pass products like the Unlimited Monthly Pass, and jurisdictional staff have conveyed the same desire to include the local transit systems in these pass products. We have asked WMATA to explore the policy and revenue implications of these changes as well. Non-fare revenue, the general manager continues to identify opportunities to increase non-fare revenue. Legislatively mandated operating costs increases. Lastly, we do want to mention that the general manager is intended to comply with the legislatively mandated 3% operating budget subsidy. New services and fare initiatives to drive ridership are funded through a mixture of fare increases, service cuts, and increases to jurisdictional subsidies. Next steps, budget deliberations are anticipated in December through February, with anticipated adoption of the FY21 budget in March 2020. And as has been mentioned earlier, we'll have a meeting of the NVTC WMATA committee on December 18th to discuss the proposed budget in depth and prepare a letter for the commission to send to WMATA on those initial proposals. And the commission will take action on the letter at its January meeting. And I think that's it. One thing related to the bus issues, we'll be getting an update next week also on the bus transformation project / study. And it'll be a report back from the consultants on that, on their recommended next steps. So we'll have a more in-depth review as to where that's going. And I think that's it for right now.
Hey, questions for our WMATA board members? Supervisor Meyer.
Yep, so I got some big questions. I think Supervisor Faust probably can ask something similar. The station's actually in his district, but my district is right across the toll road. And so literally 100 feet from the station is my district. And when I see a news item hit the news before me or my Department of Economic Development are called about this, or the chairman of the Finance and Economic Development Committee, Mr. Letourneau, or the chairman of the County Board of Supervisors, Chair Phyllis Randall, are called about it, saying that there's going to be a station named in our county, in our jurisdiction, right there, without any consultation with said county or the Department of Development, even with NDAs or whatever, that's problematic. And so I hope the board has addressed that or will address it, and would welcome your response.
We heard all your comments. We were looking at opportunities to raise revenue, you know, those non-revenue things, and it was a proposal that was brought forward. I think there were definitely lessons learned, and, you know, I think it's been tabled for right now.
Supervisor Faust?
Yeah, I mean, I was very disappointed also with the fact that it was proposed, but I was very pleased with the rapid response and, you know, you obviously listened to us when we expressed our concern. And that, I thought we were in for a fight, and I appreciate the fact that you respected our opinion on it very much.
We don't need any more.
I don't think Metro is into the whole business of adversarial
Yeah, it's
namings.
not-
It was a clear process fail
It was
that
a
all
process
interested parties were not brought to the table. So thanks to Mr. Smedberg's leadership, we walked away from the brink of doing something not smart.
Speaking me personally, I'm leaving office, but we're happy to have those conversations, right? I just think it's just making sure they're collaborative. It sounds like you all get that.
Yeah,
I'm
and
meeting
look,
in that
I'll,
for it, which is good.
yeah, and Ron, I'll own part of it. I mean, it was a process fail. I mean,
That happens.
it got ahead of itself.
Sounds like you guys are in the right direction. I appreciate it.
We're good.
Okay, other questions, Mr. Snyder?
So when you put a couple of these proposals together, it sounds like we're thinking about expanding the hours of service that would benefit primarily DC, paid for by increases on Virginia and Maryland riders who are simply going to their jobs. So those two things don't fit together very well. And I just wanted to pass that comment on.
I would just say that the docket will include a whole lot of different things, so there will be a lot of puts and takes, if you will.
Anyway, just.
If those are the only two changes, I totally understand your point, but it will be a process to determine the universe of changes, and we have a keen eye toward making sure that the system serves the needs of everyone.
Other questions for our board members?
People are frisky tonight.
Well, last meeting, you know, a lot going on. Supervisor Cook?
Yeah, I'm.
Easy, John.
At the last meeting, I politely asked about the Cinderbed Road problem because my constituents are the ones who don't get to ride the bus. And despite the poignancy of my comments, nothing happened from WMATA. So tonight I'm gonna be a little more direct because I'm pissed off, all right? Now, there are a number of reasons why you contract out services. Most people think in terms of saving money, and that's often the big reason that people look at. But another reason why you contract out services is because you don't have to deal with the problems of the service. That's what the contractor's for. So for example, my law firm contracts out payroll to Paychecks so that they do it. And we don't have to worry about missing something or making a mistake. And if they don't do payroll, we're lawyers, so we sue them, right? WMATA has a contract with Transdev under which Transdev is required to do certain things that Transdev has not done. And you sat around and done nothing for 43 days, and you have let your contractor get away with breaching its contract with you.
Just to be clear, you mean WMATA?
Yeah, I'm looking at the chair of the WMATA board
know,
and
but-
this board's representative
WMATA.
on WMATA. That's why I'm looking at, and you're my friends and colleagues, but I'm ticked off, all right? You have failed to do your job, which is to have the WMATA board consider, and I believe declare, that your contractor is in breach. And my folks can't ride the bus because you won't do your job, right? And it's not acceptable. And this commission, I think, should instruct you to bring that motion in front of the WMATA board. There's no point in having a contractor if you're not going to insist that the contractor do its job. And it's not doing its job. And no reason has been provided by WMATA for why you will not insist that your contractor do its job, except a couple mealy-mouthed press releases that have been nothing and have done nothing to move the needle at all. And no, this isn't about getting in the middle of Transdev's problems. That's why you have a contractor, so you don't have to get in the middle of them. you have to hold your contractor to account. And now you've caused a problem in Fairfax County that's much bigger. And I think we're gonna get to that in a minute.
Resolution.
But the point is
I know his point is.
that you have got to hold your contractor to account. And your failure to do so is not acceptable to this member.
Mr. Dorsey.
I mean, I would just say as the commission's member, I'm not sure how much it would apply to instructing Mr. Smedberg since he is the Commonwealth's member. But if the commission were to so direct me, I would have no problem being so directed.
Happy to make that motion. But I will defer to my colleagues.
But actually, our resolution is a little bit different.
It's a little bit different, but on that point, the frustration level is high because we don't know why that breach hasn't been declared. And so one of the challenges we're gonna face is we have a contract very similar to the one WMATA has. And clearly, there was breach today. And so there is a sense of urgency from our constituents that we have a contractor that is in breach, put them in breach immediately, declare that, start liquidated damages, take action, because to John's point, they are not performing what the contract says they should perform. And so my frustration is I don't know why we haven't done that. And maybe we don't have the answers here today. But we started an experiment to privatize a very tiny operation in Virginia, in part to save money and in part because of the General Assembly's 3% cap. Maryland has a 3% cap too, and I'm not aware of any privatization of their system, and I'm not aware of any of their customers standing on the side of the road when the bus doesn't come. And so a very deliberate decision was made at a management and board level to do this at this location. And now we don't have service, and we haven't had service for over a month. I think the least we can get is a justification for why they're not in breach of contract, because to any rider, they're in breach of contract. I mean, they're not performing. At best, they've had Sunday service. That's not what your contract with them is. I get that you're not paying for it. We're not paying for it. The riders don't care. They're not getting a ride. They don't care that we're not paying for it. They're not getting a ride. They don't want us to not pay for it. They want to get a ride. So we're trying to figure out what the reason would be not to declare a breach in this case at Cinderbed, because ultimately, and this does relate to the resolution we have later, ultimately that issue at Cinderbed is the reason we are experiencing what we're experiencing on the connector. It is the reason. And so it's no longer about a couple lines and one bus facility. It's now about an entire county. And frankly, every other bus provider in this region that might contract transit services now has been put at risk because of this one decision. And the idea that they're not in breach and they're able to get away with this for an extended period of time is allowing this to perpetuate into other systems. And so I just want to know why we haven't made that declaration.
Yeah, I think I can potentially answer that. The general manager has been delegated the ability to enter into the contract and to execute the contract, so the board would not declare the contractor to be in breach.
You gotta be kidding. Really?
Hold on. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Let me. All right. Go ahead, John.
Wow. There's something called oversight.
No, I'm not saying the board doesn't have a role. I'm just
That's
saying,
right.
you're asking why it hasn't happened to this point. I'm just saying the board would not do that. It would be the general manager.
No.
The board could exercise oversight over the general manager.
That's right. The board has oversight. And so what the board should have done, I mean, I'll tell you, within 2 hours of TransDev informing Fairfax County that it would not deliver its contracted services, we scheduled a board meeting of our board, and we're gonna meet on Tuesday, and you can damn well be sure that subject to breach is gonna come up. You guys have had 43 days and you haven't yet scheduled a meeting to talk about it. It is your job as board members to say, okay, our general manager hasn't solved this problem, and to recognize that it is a huge problem. And it is creating a domino effect, and it needs to be addressed.
All right. So I think at this point, we've given input here. I know there is something further coming. I think there is potential for the commission to take action on something tonight, whether that's direction that John's giving or another resolution or whatever, and we can have that discussion. I'm also sensitive to the fact that these are members of a corporate body, as most of us are, and sometimes you were in a position of not necessarily being able to say things in a meeting like this when you were part of a corporate body. And I don't know what the case is. I haven't had that discussion with them. So I don't know if much else is served by that. We've made the point at this point. So,
I would welcome direction from this.
all right. So on that note, then, I know Fairfax wants to do something tonight. I'm personally a lot more comfortable with John syndicating than perhaps something else, but.
If I may, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, because Mr. Dorsey has invited it, I move that this commission direct its representative to the WMATA board to call for a motion at the WMATA board to hold Transdev in breach of its contract regarding cinder bed.
Motion by Mr. Cook,
Second.
second by Supervisor Meyer. Okay. You want to?
I've said enough.
Okay.
So let me just
Go
say
ahead.
why I second it. So I haven't seen the resolution yet from Fairfax or what.
Well, let me clear. Right now, there's nothing on the table. So
Well,
this
I
is the
know,
only.
but
yeah.
what I'm saying is, me personally, I'm much more comfortable going with the breach route than trying to make an overarching statement on privatization along with it. I haven't seen your resolution, but I don't know anything about that, if that's anything that's in there. I think directing our representative to do everything to explore holding them in breach, obviously with some sort of reasonable, if we don't know something, we don't know something. But I tend to agree with John, if they're in breach in 3 days, I think it's reasonable to direct you to go ahead and do that.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
So, so I do have a resolution and I have copies to send around the table, so that everyone has a copy of that. It relates, to
rather keep
the
mine
strike, our strike now on the connector service, and how it relates to the strike at Cinderbed. The issue that Supervisor Cook has raised is a little bit different, but related to what, Fairfax County is going to be talking about, because we're unhappy with our contractor, and we feel that, and I think it's a majority of us feel that they are in breach of, their contract, what we contracted with them to do. My resolution is a little bit different from what Supervisor Cook has raised. I think I will pass it around the table so that everybody has a copy of it.
There is. We should have this. Yeah, and we will keep these motions separate. So right now, this is being passed out in case it's made by, yes. But you want to speak to Mr. Cook?
Yeah, well, I was just
Okay.
gonna clarify that I'm prepared to vote for both because they are different. What John's motion is the here and now. What our motion is, how we got into this mess.
Well, and you can.
And I'm gonna speak to that later, but I think it's important now for people voting on John's is if we're gonna vote only on the breach piece, that's fine. That will deal with the immediate concern and will give direction to our WMATA board members to do something, but it does not correct the larger elephant in the room. And so for people who are interested in the larger elephant, there will be a chance to take action on that as well.
Mr. Chairman, I would
Yes.
suggest that we vote on the
Yeah,
motion.
we are going to. This is being
And then-
distributed for informational purposes so that
Right,
people
and
actually have
then-
time to read it.
And then we could have a chance.
But we are on debate on the motion now from Mr. Cook. Mr. Lamagna is next.
No, I was gonna move the pending question, but if others want to speak, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Fass.
I very much support Supervisor Cook's motion, but I think it has to be caveat because we haven't, at least I haven't read the Metro contract with Transdev. And for us to say we declare a default without having done that is difficult to do. I assume they're in default, but there should be some caveat language in there that respects the fact that we don't know for certain. To the extent they are in default, there should be a declaration. That's where I'm at.
No, if I may, I don't disagree with that point. I tried to, and now I don't remember the exact words I said, but I think what I said was directed to make a motion to, to look at that. So if in fact legal counsel were to advise that there was not a breach, then I think we would not be directing Mr. Dorsey to do something that they couldn't do. But I did ask the question last month, and I thought the answer was that there was no excuse, no contractual excuse for non-performance that had been raised. So
That is correct.
That is.
Others who wish to speak to Mr. Cook's motion?
I just want to ask a question. I presume it's implied, but in going back and looking at the idea of whether or not they're in breach, we're not just looking from the date of the strike, because they were in breach of contract way before the strike happened. The service was deteriorating rapidly. I brought this issue up at past NVTC meetings. People were patting themselves on the back at what happened at Cinderbed, and my constituents were stranded before the strike even happened because they didn't have people reporting. They had a whole bunch of issues down there. And so I just hope it's implied that if we're looking at whether or not they're in breach, we're looking even beyond the date that the strike happened, and we're looking at the contract duration. That you all are aware of that. If you weren't, that be looked at in the context of whether they're in breach or not.
Okay. Any further discussion? All in favor of Mr. Cook's motion, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Anybody abstain? Mr. Dorsey and Mr. Smedberg are abstaining. Okay, now we have a resolution that's been distributed by.
That passed, right?
Yes, that motion passed unanimously with 2 abstentions.
Could I just give the motion right back? I'm happy to vote it for it, but I just want to just be clear.
Can you do that, Rhonda? You have that or the exact motion?
Well, yeah, but
Oh,
we'll
no. You're the board reporter. It's not you.
Do we need verbatim? I mean, I'm instructed to, within the parameters of what is legal, to make a motion to the WMATA
Bring
board
the issue to the board of the breach.
to have the board consider having the general manager declare TransDev to be in violation of its contract.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, there's another resolution that's been distributed. Chair Malova, if you want to address it and you want to make a motion.
Another resolution, everybody has a copy of it. It begins with a bunch of whereases, sets the stage. Remembering that this started with our getting funding for a state of good repair. And in part of the package for doing that included a 3% cap on increases to WMATA's annual operating budget. We go on to say that WMATA is considering a variety of strategies to reduce annual operating costs, including privatizing the operations at the Cinderbed Road Bus Garage, which is in Fairfax County in the Lee District, and is considering privatizing the operations of the Metro Rail Silver Line. And whereas private operators and the unions have been unable to agree on labor contract, and employees at Cinderbed Road Bus Garage have been on strike for more than 45 days. This disruption of service has created significant hardships for transit riders in Northern Virginia. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission thereby expresses concern about the two-tier wage benefit structure that has been created by WMATA's decision to contract out the operations at the Cinderbed Road Bus Garage. Now, therefore, be it further resolved that the Commission urges WMATA management take a more active role in resolving the labor contract at Cinderbed so that bus service can be restored to passengers as quickly as possible. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Commission urges that if WMATA intends to contract out Metro Rail service or Silver Line train operations, that it avoid the establishment of a two-tier wage and benefit structure between its own employees and a contractor's employees, which has created that problem at the Cinderbed Road bus garage. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the commission requests that WMATA seek other strategies to reduce costs to limit its annual operating subsidy increase of 3%. So moved. If I get a second, then I would like to speak to
Second.
it.
Second by Mr. McKay. Sure,
Um,
go ahead and give it up to me.
This is not about not privatizing maybe some of the operations of WMATA. Fairfax County has privatized our connector service. It's been operated by the private sector for 30 years. And when you have a self-contained service and agency or organization, that has worked for us. We've also contracted out other services. We contract out custodial service. And sometimes we put that out to bid and we change who is going to be providing those services. In this case, Fairfax County was initially supportive of privatization for WMATA to try to bring down costs for operation. What is happening at Cinderbed, however, when we talk about a two-tier situation, you have Metro employees working next to contract employees, and they have different benefits, they have different salaries, they have different criteria, and that's not working. That has created friction, and we want to point that out, make sure that that is resolved, whatever it takes to get that resolved. The second part of it is the Silver Line. We look ahead at the Silver Line operations, which Metro has stated they are going to privatize. Fairfax County, frankly, has not been opposed to that until we looked at what happened at Cinderbed, where you have two classes now of employees doing the same work and operating with different benefits, different wages, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, this essentially will, hopefully if it passes, let WMATA know the difficulties, not of privatizing, because if done correctly, privatization can work. Privatizing payroll, privatizing engineering, so long as you've got a self-contained sort of operation where you have not created the kind of friction that you're seeing at Cinderbed, and that I think you will see if we do the same sort of thing on the Silver Line.
Okay, Mr. Meyer.
Yeah, so I think as the other Silver Line jurisdiction or the other main Silver Line jurisdiction, Loudoun, not just me, Supervisor Turner, Loudoun as a whole has a lot of problems with this resolution. First of all, being that what I did a pretty energetic resolution once, but it was shared beforehand, so we could all take a look and digest it. We're just getting this now. Secondly, there's a lot of problematic language in here that Loudoun would want to actually look into before supporting when we're talking about Silver Line, considering we have to fund a significant amount of operations along with Fairfax. And so I'm fine going along with a resolution that speaks to the ongoing crisis, right? I am not okay with, and I don't think the county would be okay with speaking to this without actually fully analyzing the impacts of what we'd be saying. So I have an amendment to that effect that I'm going to make. So in the second whereas, I will strike after garage. And I would strip the first, third, and fourth, now therefore be it resolved clauses from
First
the
and
document.
third?
The
Or
first,
fourth?
third, and fourth.
Okay. All right, so Mr. Myers made an amendment. The amendment would strike the first, third, and fourth, therefore be it resolved clauses.
And it would strip after the second whereas after garage. So any reference basically to the Silver Line or to strategies that would be used on this.
Mr. Chairman?
Okay, hold on one sec. I see, okay. So that's a amendment that's on the table. I will second the amendment.
Can I ask a point of clarification?
Yes.
Would this be in conflict with what we've just directed our WMATA representative to do?
No, so this simply removes language, so it wouldn't be anything in conflict. So it's just any reference to Silver Line.
No, but if I may, so this says,
Keeping the second,
the second be it resolved is urging WMATA management to take a more active role in resolving the labor contract is, seems to me to be a little bit at odds with
Right.
directing a WMATA
Well,
rep to
it-
tell them to
the
hold them
second, the
breach.
second, that was gonna be in there whether or not my amendment existed. So yeah, that was gonna be there whether or not my amendment existed. That phrase is, the clause is gonna be there. So I think it's
Keeping
more,
the second.
Yeah,
we are keeping.
Okay.
I don't,
It's more
I don't see
additive.
what, I don't think as a parliamentary matter that's in conflict at all.
Yeah, I think it's more additive
No.
to say, and we sort of already directed him to take more action, but we gave him a specific, but it also, I think this is speaking, this to me speaks more to the details behind that, saying, listen, like our people are feeling it and here's the monetary impact and, you know, we need you guys to step up.
Okay, so now we're on the amendment, Mr. Evans.
Yeah, not to belabor this too much, but could we just divide the motion so we could vote on his, he has three things he wants to strike. The last one about seek other strategies, I'd like to just have a separate vote on that, so I can vote differently than I might vote on the rest of it.
Okay. Do that. All right, let me speak to the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask a
Of course.
point of clarification? So Senator Evan would like to sever the motion, but what part are we severing?
Only the last section, the mission request to
About
modify other
3%
strategies.
other strategies.
The fourth now therefore be
Great,
resolved.
thank you.
So, point of order, Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman. Has either the motion to amend or the amendment to the motion to amend been seconded?
Yes,
It has.
both have.
So I-
The motion was seconded by Mr. McKay, and I seconded the amendment from
The
Mr. Black.
amended, okay, so there
Yes.
is so on the floor right now
Is an amendment to
is an
the
amendment
underlying
to
motion.
this motion.
Yes,
And I'm still not clear what we're keeping and what we're.
so, so let me, yeah.
Only.
So it pains me tonight to have to oppose a motion ultimately if I have to from Chair Bulova. Given what I said earlier, but I
you can't get
Sounds like
along
a
with
you
Sharon.
problem.
Take it back.
Yeah. No, I know, no, it's not. But no, that cake was good. With the greatest respect, and I understand the urgency, I see this as a very egregious process foul. This is not how this commission operates. We are in the Silver Line together. And so we've known about privatization of the Silver Line potentially for years. So to have this dropped on us as a policy decision tonight with no prior discussion, no notice, I find out about it in the executive committee room is really unfair to us and to the entire team. And it's not fair to the staff who have not discussed this. I don't know how even my future board or my current board will react to some of this. I suspect there'll be some sympathy even on the two-tiered wage and benefit structure issue. But I also don't know how I could possibly know that tonight without having the opportunity to even have a discussion about it. So given the urgency of what happened today, I think it's entirely appropriate for us to take some action and support our colleagues in Fairfax who are dealing with this. And I also think it's even appropriate for us to start looking at why. And what Mr. McKay said earlier is entirely right. This is about a larger issue. It's about decisions that WMATA's made. The details of the contract, we don't really know or understand that well, and we didn't get much clarity from tonight. But this body speaking for all of Virginia and giving direction to Metro on something like this cannot be done just like that with no discussion. And that's what's happening. So the reason I supported this amendment is because I think it removes these policy questions that I would be fully supportive of having discussion up here at the commission about. But the reality is this is really about cost, and WMATA's decisions to outsource some of these contracts came because of stress that was placed on by the lack of ability for a lot of jurisdictions to pay more and by the cap that was imposed from the General Assembly. And so, you know, the general manager is making certain decisions. I think he owes us a better explanation. And I think the motion that Mr. Cook made gets to that about why we're here. But I think we need to keep the discussion into what's really happening right now and leave our direction a little broad and not get into very specific issues about two-tier wage structure, at least tonight. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I don't support the amendment. I support the original resolution. I appreciate the timing, but Your jurisdiction didn't go on strike today.
I understand.
You don't have thousands of people. You watch our system, yours will be next. And so would have been great to be able to circulate this a week ago. Would have been great to resolve the cinder bed issue 45 days ago. Our people are standing on the street, and this is why they're standing on the street. If anyone doesn't understand why the strike is happening, they're not paying attention. You have two employees doing the same job, driving a Metro bus, wearing the same uniforms, getting paid entirely different wages and benefits. No employer would do that to their employees. No private employer would do that to their employees. And that's what has happened at Cinderbed. And the idea that somehow people are just going to stand by and think, well, we'll work that out, or it's not about privatization. The point is you have two people there doing the same job, getting paid different benefits. You wouldn't do that in your local government. You wouldn't do it in your private company. It's what WMATA has allowed happen at the Cinderbed Garage. And because of the Cinderbed Garage, it now has infected the connector system. Why is this such a big issue for the union? In part because they're listening to conversations about Metro doing a lot of other privatization. What we're trying to do here is to say that if it didn't work at Cinderbed with buses, let's take a hard look at that before we do anything in the Silver Line. And the idea that after what has happened at Cinderbed, that we as local government officials wouldn't be concerned enough about that to say, hey, Metro, before you think further about doing this on the Silver Line, you might want to look at what's happening at this bus garage. Because at the end of the day, saving money is really important, but moving passengers is a lot more important. And passengers aren't getting moved now. And they're not going to be moved by the thousands for an extended period of time. And to call on we are local elected officials. To call on our local elected officials to stand up and do something to get our people back on the bus, and to say we owe it at least to them to tell our Metro representatives, to tell the Metro board that we need to learn something from this exercise. Because even if this was resolved tomorrow, my resolve to say, let's not do that same thing on the Silver Line remains intact. And the sooner we say something about that while we're living through this now, the better in terms of getting better information back to us before that decision has to be made. This doesn't say don't do privatization of the Silver Line. It says, look at what's happening at the Cinderbed Garage, because that's exactly what happened. I would be open to changing some of the language on the one for be it resolved that says avoid the establishment, to say to consider the challenges that have been created by the establishment of a two-tier wage and benefit, if that would soften the motion. What we want to have happen here is to say, WMATA, look at what you're doing. Look at what has happened. Think long and hard about that as it relates to the Silver Line. And in the meantime, do something about Cinderbed so that our connector buses can get back on the road. I mean, to me, I find nothing in here objectionable, but if the maker of the motion, and it's the will of the commission to change some of the language that says avoid the establishment of the two-tier, and rather say further evaluate the challenges that have happened as a result of the establishment of a two-tier wage structure, that I can live with. But make no mistake about it, that is what has happened at the garage. So we can sit and talk about, we didn't know about it, we didn't understand. For 45 days, that's what has been going on there now. Now that, as of today, is what's happening in our connector system. And it will shut down transit in this region. If our connector buses don't run, you worry about traffic on 66, wait until you see what it's like next week.
Okay, Mr. Meyer, I'm trying to get everybody. Mr. Meyer was first.
Let's go back to the very beginning when this whole question of the Metro system needed to be completely redone. And it was about a safety culture. We had accidents, we had people being killed. And so the idea, and we had a system that was falling apart, both rail and bus. And the safety culture cuts across all of that. And I'm not trying to make excuses for the general manager of Metro, but a 3% cap arbitrarily across an entire organization as complex as the Metro system is really nonsensical. And I don't believe it. It sounds great, and some people want to vote on it, but it's really bad public policy. It really is bad, because this is a complex system, and some of the costs of this system, especially when you're trying to rebuild it to a state of good repair, and you're trying to change the safety culture, you got to be able to put resources on key areas to make the difference. And A better way to do this would be to possibly look at certain categories of operations or categories of programs and encapsulate them or declare them not subject to the 3%, or go back to the General Assembly and say, make it 3.5, 3.75, or figure out some other way to save some costs. I agree completely with with Commissioner McKay with respect to having two people side by side. And that is just the seeds of what you will eventually have disgruntlement, and you'll be back to where you don't have a good safety culture. And that's really what this is really about. And so I can't support the substitute motion simply because it's not ripe enough. I think there's something much more fundamental here. And I think we do have to go on record with respect to this two-tiered system. And I think it would be I think it ought to be, well, I think we ought to cease and desist. I think Metro ought to cease and desist and figure out a different way to save costs. Now, we shouldn't stand here and micromanage the general manager's efforts to save money. I understand that. But I think the bigger picture here is that we're trying to reposition this system for the next 20 to 30 years, both in terms of state of good repair and building a new generation of workforce that embraces safety as a highest priority. And the way you do that is to create esprit de corps and a good relationship where everybody's on a team working together. And what you have here is the seeds of discord and labor unrest that could be avoided.
Mr. Dorsey?
So I think, it's always clear that if there's lots of conversation that needs to take place, that maybe it's not the time to put pen to paper and approve something. I can appreciate all of that. However, I would like to remind us all that this issue didn't emerge 45 days ago. This issue has really been known to all of us for a while, whether or not we chose to embrace it or not. But when the general manager of Metro, an organization that's an 80% budget based on paying people, talks about saving money by privatizing, whether you chose to lean into it or not, what he was always talking about was paying certain people less to do the work that other people are currently doing. So this was known long before, 45 days ago. We just as a body didn't do anything about it. So, I know we're upset. We should be. I would be pissed off if I were a Fairfax resident who relied on these bus operations. I would be pissed off if I were a Fairfax supervisor. But this is not something that emerged 45 days ago. It emerged the day the decision was made and people decided to allow this regime to take place, this plan to take place at Cinderbed.
That's no reason.
Mr. Vargas.
So, first of all, I appreciate Chairman Bullova's comment about privatization. I think privatization can and does work when done properly. I think it saves money. I think it's more efficient in many cases. I don't know if it would change the intent of the resolution if that first therefore about the two-tier wage system, if it were changed to a whereas. Because it is more about background. It is more about, how we got here. It's not necessarily, so it could be a whereas WMATA employees have expressed concerns about.
Well, all right. I think right now we're on a substitute motion, which
I'm gonna withdraw the substitute to amend the main motion.
you're gonna do what?
I'm gonna withdraw my
You had a request to sever.
You just had a request to set up.
Okay, I don't, no longer want to request that.
Okay.
Okay.
That's fine,
Never
but right now we're on a substitute. So if the substitute fails, then we'll go back and potentially have amendments to the underlying motion, but we're debating the substitute. Mr. Lemay.
Just a question, do we really need this resolution tonight? Issues like Silver Line, 3%, I mean, we've got, I think, a little time. It would be great if Loudon and Fairfax could collaborate on a resolution, bring it to the next meeting, which I won't be here to enjoy, but I think that just makes a stronger statement, especially if you can get a unanimous vote on an unamended resolution.
I I would agree with that. but-
Well, if that's a friendly amendment, to send an item to the next NVTC meeting to have a discussion and a possible resolution on the Silver Line and other privatization issues, I would take that as a fair.
Yeah, so a couple things. First, I'll respond to that. I think that would be a terrible option to take for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is what you're saying is, as us elected officials, we're okay with 30 more days of people not getting rides, because that's what'll happen. Excuse me, and secondly, I would say we just have half the commission tonight not coming back next month. So you're gonna have a half a commission of new people come in who may not know anything about what we're talking about, and you're gonna ask them to vote on this. Third, issues of consideration of privatization, my understanding is, and I'm asking this of our Metro Board members, may likely come up at the Metro Board before we meet again. Is that an agenda item that you all are gonna be reviewing and be considering between now and when this commission next meets?
I'm aware of.
Not that I'm aware of.
I've heard contrary, and frankly, after what Mr. Meyer was just talking about with regard to the naming rights, and how that came about, I am concerned that something could come up at Metro and we won't have a chance to weigh in on it, with regard to this specific issue. To Mr. Dorsey, I would say I respectfully disagree a little bit with the way in which it was described by you a moment ago about we knew about it. Knowing about the idea of looking at possible privatization for savings to stay within a 3% cap is different than agreeing to an obvious two-tier system that was being set up. To me, those are two exclusively different things. I think there are plenty of ways Metro could have privatized without setting up a two-tier system. I think what happened is there was an opportunity because there was a new program opening. And by the way, this new facility was built because of complaints from employees about working conditions at the old facility. I know because I brought the motion forward to approve it and get it out of the city of Alexandria, which had significant challenges with operations at their facility, mostly because of worker safety. So we built a brand new facility down there. Nobody knew at the time it was built we were going to go to privatization. Nobody opposed privatization being looked at for savings by the Metro Board, but that's different than saying we knew about this specific thing and what the effects were going to be on it. In my opinion, a management fail on paper to look at this one facility and say, we're going to set up a two-tier system here and it's going to work. I mean, in hindsight, I don't know how that ever could have worked. And so if we were going to look at privatization, we should have looked at privatizing an element of the Metro system, system-wide, not pick one place in Virginia and experiment with them. And as I said before, this 3% cap is just not ours. Maryland agreed to it too. And so obviously there's savings being created to stay within the 3% cap for Maryland's subsidy increase. But the route that we took in Virginia was to look at this one facility and privatize it. That's not something that I supported. And so the idea of privatization is different than supporting the privatization of this facility. And that's what I take a little bit of issue with. I said throughout this, and including at this commission, when people were celebrating the success of this, I said the system, the service was rapidly deteriorating long before the strike ever happened. And nobody was responding, nobody was doing anything about it. And now here we are where we are today. And so I do not think waiting another month will do what we want it to do. I don't think putting half a new commission in front of a new concept like this a month from now does us any additional service. I don't think there's anything in this motion that we in our hearts of hearts don't already know is happening. And so I don't support delaying it for a month.
Okay. It really wasn't my intention to let people speak twice on the one motion, so that's my mistake and I apologize. But Ms. Kristen.
Let me say this. I support the motion and I think that
We're on the substitute.
On the substitute, but where I'm going is actually speaks to the substitute.
Yes, go ahead. No, fine.
I think it could be an alternative. I think Chair Volova and Supervisor McKay have made a really excellent point about why the issue of privatization, particularly with regard to jobs that are being done in parallel by Metro employees, is not an ideological issue. It is a matter of the public interest and of riders' interest. And I support it as written. I will also, however, support it 1 month from now. And notwithstanding the concerns about the changeover in the commission, which I think are very well made, I think that the process concerns that have been raised by our chair and by others really are the right ones. This is an issue that does, because it gets to matters of ideology, longstanding sensitive points about resource expenditures on the WMATA board on behalf of the Commonwealth and the other two signatories to the compact, has the risk of looking like a political football. And I think, as Mr. Lemunyan put it, to have a divided vote, a hotly divided vote on this issue really risks muddling a message that I think should be ultra clear about our concerns. And so it actually is because of my support for this motion that I would really suggest that we consider deferring it for a month. I have a little bit of hesitation to do that over the strong objection of the maker and seconder of the motion. So rather than propose a deferral, I'm going to put that out there, see how you both feel and whether you know, where you stand on that. But I really do think that to have a month of reflection, a more organized position from Loudon so that all of us can consider it, maybe some insights from our staff here at the commission, and perhaps some insights from, further insights from our WMATA representatives could all be healthy in getting to an unmuddled and clear message about where we stand with regard to not privatization, but as you've described, the two-tier wage and benefit system going forward.
Okay. John and Kanik haven't gotten in yet, so I saw John first and then him.
Thanks. I appreciate being allowed to pound the table in my prior remarks, but I will not do that this time. And I'm trying to play a little bit of lawyer here, see if we can figure something out here. I agree with Chairman Letourneau's general statement about process and how ideally, you know, we want to get things out in advance and have time to consider and these kinds of, I mean, as a general principle, I am in agreement with that. We also have to understand that this commission meets once a month and things change sometimes in the world and sometimes they change rapidly. And things have changed rapidly. And so some of the urgency that you're hearing from us in Fairfax County is because things have changed rapidly. I think, as several people have said, that contracting can be a good management strategy at certain times. I am neither pro nor anti-union. I've had union support in my campaigns. I've supported management initiatives. So I don't come at it from that standpoint, but my number one concern is people need to be able to get on with the bus. And that concern is above and beyond any other issue for me here tonight. I am concerned about a few things. One, I think that we are getting sucked into a proxy war. This is a nationwide battle between Transdev, which is the #1 strike breaker contractor for transit in the country, and the ATU, which is the #1 union for transit workers in the country. I don't want to be the guinea pig in a proxy war between these two folks. And we're getting sucked into that at the detriment of the people of our region. That is a bad place for us to be. And the us is everyone in this room. It's not just Fairfax. It will, Jeff is right. Whoever else has transit service by either this union and or this company is going to get sucked into this thing. And we really need to extricate Northern Virginia out of this and not be the guinea pig and the battleground for a union war. That is not where we ought to be. So I think we need to do something. I was supportive of the general manager's overall proposal 2-3 years ago, right? Because we said to him, you must get a plan that saves money, and he came up with one. But we all looked at, and we all knew this was a problematic piece, but we also knew that we needed, quite frankly, the Virginia state government to be on board. And this piece was important for that. Things have changed. Good, bad, or indifferent, there's been an election, things are different now. And, you know, people in the room, we've been on different sides of that. But the fact is that that framework is now different. And going forward, I don't think, I don't see in the long run, Virginia now being sort of the pro-contracting place that maybe it was. And I do think that because of that, this two-tiered issue it's going to shift. And the way it was set up, and I don't fault the general manager for his plan of 2-3 years ago. At that time, it was a good plan. At this time, it needs to be looked at again. If you actually read the motion, it primarily asks that things be looked at. The only thing I would suggest, I think Jeff already said that he would agree to it, is in the second to last, now therefore, the word avoid. If instead of saying avoid, say consider challenges of,
To further evaluate the effects of
right,
or the.
then we're no longer directing any one particular action. Because I do think that is a legitimate concern. Many people have said is without further, discussion, without getting input, we're directing one particular result. I do think we need to direct the look at the issue. And if the maker of the underlying motion would change that word, I think then the motion is in a posture where I would suggest, from what I've heard, I would hope the commission would support it and not support the amendment.
As the maker of the original motion.
Yeah.
The language that has been suggested, I would accept as the maker of the motion, and that would then read, so this is the third, whereas.
All right, hold on a second. Let me tell you what we're gonna do. Okay, we've got a lot of people who haven't spoken. I got 2 over here that are jumping again. I'm gonna let them get in.
Inquiry, are we amending the?
No,
substitute?
we're not. That's why I stopped that. We're still on the substitute
Where we
motion.
are right
My intent at this point is to let these 2 gentlemen speak who have both been trying to speak. And then we're going to take a recess for a couple minutes to have a discussion about some of these potential amendments. So we are not sitting up here on the fly trying to do things. We're going to see, we'll vote on the substitute if we need to, and then if there's changes to the amendment, we'll do that. But this is gonna get out of hand if we don't do that. So Kenneth, go ahead. You've been.
So I agree with the sentiments of the chair when he said it makes me uneasy getting this tonight, right now. Although I totally understand the sentiments from our colleagues from Fairfax County with the immediacy that's needed. And I agree a lot with Ms. Crystal in terms of if we're gonna have a full-on resolution, we may need to, because I'm in support of this, but we may need to make sure that it's solid, do it next month. Now, I'm curious if there's a potential to do something where with Supervisor Cook, we said to give some direction to our representative to WMATA. Is there a way for us to just do that again and say we want to give direction within this resolution without making a formal resolution? That way we are giving some clear action to take now, but then also making this stronger going forward. Because again, as we're looking forward into the future, this needs to be a lot more solid.
Okay. And Mr. Skiles.
Yeah, this is more of a process question. I'm going to maybe suggest along the lines of what you said, Mr. Chairman. I think just judging by the comments that have been made, there's probably an appetite to do something. I might suggest maybe borrowing a process that goes on in Richmond. I know we might not always want to do what they do, but there's a lot of smart people around this table. Maybe put an ad hoc group together and step into another room for 5 or 10 minutes and wordsmith this. I think we may be able to get something worked out.
Unfortunately, unlike Richmond, we have the extra burden of local government rules that are following our. So we can't quite do that, but
I think you can get.
I think we can have individual conversations that might help us. Okay. Okay, hold on, Mr. Faust, yes.
Just speaking to the amendment and keeping it very short, it would read that the commission urges WMATA management take a more active role in resolving the labor contract. We have already done that on multiple occasions, and Mr. Weiderfeld has not.
Well, the commission hasn't.
Pardon?
The commission.
The commission has not, but I mean, the message has been sent very, very clearly, and nothing has happened. So I think on that basis, I will oppose the amendment because it will get us nowhere.
Mr. Meyer, final word, then I'm gonna
Yeah,
call
this
for a
is-
recess
yeah,
and have a discussion
this
with
is
you
my
and a few of my colleagues.
So what a lot of people have said is exactly what this is proposing. Take out the things that need to be discussed, send it to next month's meeting, and pass an immediate item that says, MWA, go resolve this issue and the label contract, right? That's exactly what what the amendment is intended and does do, right? And so some of these issues, I'm very sympathetic to Supervisor McCade, a lot of your points. The issue is that you're saying half of a new commission might not understand it. The problem is 80% of the commission didn't understand it before walking in tonight, right? Because we weren't briefed on it. If you put it in the briefing packet for the next commission, let them actually digest it, they might be actually able to take action. Furthermore, we need to go back to our board, like Supervisor Letourneau said. We're half the silver, or not half, we're a good chunk of the silver line. We need to go do that, right? And so give us time to do that. Let's have this discussion next month and make sure that we have a unified front. It's important to speak as one region. I think you know that. You're gonna be chairman of the board. We have to speak as one region. And so that's why I made this amendment, to take out the stuff that we need to discuss, put forward the stuff we can all agree on, send it to next month, and then that way we can take a unified stance on an issue that you clearly think is important, that I think is important.
Okay. Let me go ahead and just do what I said I'm going to do, which is take a 5-minute recess so I can confer with my staff member and with Mr. Meyer, and then let's see where we end up, if we need to vote on that substitute or whether there's some changes that we can make. Okay?
I could go home and go to bed. Yeah.
So run up, there you go.
Yeah.
Okay. Commission is back in order. There's an amendment on the table, which is a substitute by Mr. Meyer. Mr. Meyer, do you wish to withdraw the substitute amendment?
In lieu of going and taking a walk or going home to bed, I think I will withdraw. As suggested by some commissioners, I will withdraw amendment.
Okay. There is, Sharon have the name. So, in front of you is a revised reversion of the amendment offered by Chair Bulova. So essentially, this would need to be made as a substitute motion. Do you wish to do that,
And
Sharon?
so, yes, I will move a substitute motion, and the changes.
Actually, why don't you withdraw your original motion and then just make this as a
Withdraw
new?
my
Yep.
original main motion,
Yep.
seconder, also is in agreement.
Do you not have it?
No.
Okay, I'm sorry. It was supposed to get all the way around. Hold on a sec. Let's make sure everybody gets it.
That's because Ron was supposed to say.
Somehow we just skipped you. That's not. Does everybody have it now?
It's just a white page.
Okay, okay. So that underlying motion has now been withdrawn and all, so there's nothing on the table, so go ahead, Chair Bullock.
So I will move the resolution that we have previously had before us with the following changes. The last or the first now therefore be it resolved is now a whereas, and it reads, whereas the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission hereby expresses concern about the two-tier wage and benefit structure that has been created by WMATA's decision to contract out the operations of the Cinderbed Road bus garage and which has resulted in service disruption. The next now therefore be it resolved, or now it is the first, reads that the commission urges WMATA management to take a more active role in resolving the labor contract at the Cinderbed Road bus garage so that bus service can be restored to passengers as quickly as possible. The second, now therefore be it resolved, reads that the commission urges that WMATA evaluate the effects, of a two-tier wage and benefit structure between its own employees and a contractor's employees.
In current and future.
In current and future contracting, and I would say decisions or whatever. And then lastly, now therefore be it resolved that the commission requests that WMATA seek other strategies to reduce costs to limit the annual operating subsidy increase to 3%. So moved.
Okay, motion's made, seconded by Mr. McKay. Any further discussion needed on this? Mr. Dorsey.
Sorry to be that guy, but just in this first resolve clause, instead of the term being labor contract, I think it's more accurate to say labor dispute. That is the thing that is at issue, not a contract.
Okay, friendly amendment by Mr. Dorsey to change the word contract to dispute. Is that accepted?
That is accepted.
And the seconder?
Yes.
Okay. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Anyone abstain? Mr. Lemonnion abstains. Motion carries with Mr. Lemonnion abstaining and Mr. Spielberg abstaining also? Or did you vote?
I'll abstain at this.
You'll abstain? Okay. Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Okay. We were in the middle of the WMATA report. We had finished, I think, the Virginia section. Or I'm going to say that we have, even if we haven't. Post-summer 2019 shutdown lessons learned.
We are happy to move that to the January.
I think that'd be a great topic for the
Okay.
January meeting. Which then brings us to the Legislative and Policy Committee. Mr. Meyer or staff? Whoever you want me to recognize. Staff to recognize.
I don't think there's really any changes from what we discussed last month on
We
the
have
grid.
incorporated the changes that were provided to us earlier, and Zach's going to do a brief overview of our legislative agenda, which is included in your materials.
Sure. Thank you.
So the legislative agenda has not changed much since the November commission meeting. There were some minor edits to the language, and so I'll just briefly go through it. But again, this year's legislative agenda does not present any major shifts in policy direction for the commission. With that, the Legislative and Policy Committee decided to keep many priorities in 2019. To start with the state legislative agenda, the first 4 priorities are meant to protect existing funding streams for transit and to restore and secure new transit funding new transit funding that benefits the region. To that point, we echo the NVTA in restoring their funding and support the Commonwealth's funding and financing improvements. The committee included long-term sustainable funding to deliver transit projects today and in the future as well. Priorities 5 and 6 are in support of 2 proposals to expand transit benefits for workers across the state, particularly for low-income workers in the TANF program, and a state business tax section for organizations to provide transit benefits to employees. And our last 2 proposals on the state side are specific to NVTC. The first is to ensure that NVTC continues to administer its programs to promote transit in North Virginia. And we also want to propose changing the due date of our annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. On the federal side, again, most of these priorities were included in the 2019 agenda. There are key pieces of legislation that have expired or are expiring soon that affect transit nationwide. Just briefly, we support renewed dedicated federal funding for WMATA and applaud our local and congressional delegations for pushing for this as well. We want to support a strong transit component in the next surface transportation bill or any congressional infrastructure package. We also want to ensure that all transit operators receive the maximum federal funding credits. And we're echoing WMATA's legislative ask that constraints like the 3% cap are considered in contract negotiations. And finally, we're in support of restoring employer-provided commuter tax benefits. That is my report.
Okay.
Any questions?
Questions? Yes, sir.
Oh, no, not a question.
Oh, comment.
Move approval of the
Approval. I like
policy
that.
agenda.
Second.
I like that. Motion's made and seconded. Discussion on the agenda. Wow. Nothing like a couple of fights to get everybody moving along. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carries unanimously. All right. Yes, all right. Yes, Jim. Mr. Lemonion's abstaining. Okay. Sorry. So that brings us to our VRE reports. Oh, yes, sir. Did you have,
I just
okay.
wanted to remind everybody of our program on Monday morning.
Oh, yeah.
Well, absolutely, yes, indeed. So we do have our joint legislative briefing with PRTC on Monday. I know we have a number of commissioners already signed up. I think our RSVP list is close to something like 120. So we do expect to have a fantastic event, and we will be opening the event for us in your district. Secretary Valentine will be speaking, and then we'll have Paul Wiedefeld and Rich Dalton from VRE, and myself and Bob Schneider, basically giving an overview of our legislative priorities for the coming year. So I look forward to seeing folks.
And Virginia Transit Day is
Virginia Transit Day in the General Assembly is Monday, January 27th. VACO and VML Day is the first Thursday in February. February 6th, which will be, everybody have a great time in lieu of the NVTC meeting in February.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Now we're moving to VRE.
Thank you.
Mr.
He's over here.
Yes.
He's over here.
Oh, okay. Oh, boy, we're switching things up now. Yes, sir.
So I'll be, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be concise. Just report on a couple of things here. System on-time performance, and again, you can get the detail in the attached CEO report, but this is updated since the CEO report that you have. But just want to paint a little bit of a picture here. We operated a total 588 trains in the month of November. Out of those 588 trains, 125 of those trains were delayed. Delay, by our definition, is they exceed the 5-minute threshold at their destination station. So approximately 80% of our trains were on time. This is unaudited. Out of those 125 delayed trains, 90 of those trains, or 72% of those delays, were due to congestion. Rail congestion, and of course, that's a broad category. But various train interferences as it relates to Amtrak, CSX, Norfolk Southern. On the freight side, of course, it is peak season for them, hauling a bunch of stuff, hauling a bunch of Christmas stuff, if you will, across the nation. But just want to make the point, I know there's a lot of discussion going on about expansion, particularly Long Bridge, and all the associated projects. This is a real issue for us, and it's a real issue for us today. Out of those delays, of course, the average delay is about 14 minutes. And of course, we had 6 trains that were greater than 30 minutes. So the delays are not extensive, but yet they are delays, and they are causing, reliability issues with our system. I'll just jump to ridership. We typically see November and December ridership drop off. For November, we're at 13,315 average daily riders. That's exactly 14 additional daily riders year over year. So relatively flat. I'll say we also, we kicked off the preliminary engineering and environmental work on the Crystal City Station project that we have going on in Arlington this past week. And then just finally, Santa trains. Just remind everybody, on December 14th, we'll be operating our annual Operation Lifesaver BRE Santa trains. We sold out tickets just like we normally do. Online sold out in about 3.5 minutes. That was about 6,500. That was 6,500 tickets. We sold out 3.5 minutes. The other 4,100 tickets at our vendor locations all sold out within 2 hours. So it's still a very popular event.
Sorry. I said more trains.
More.
We need to expand the Long Bridge before we can offer more Santa trains.
And then I'll just leave you with this. We are really emphasizing, as we do every year, we participate in the Toys for Tots with the Marines. We're really emphasizing we want to do a really big push this year. We'll do an onboard collection next week, December 11th. Unwrap gifts and cash, and then we'll of course be collecting toys or unwrapped gifts and cash on the December 14th event out there. But that's a big push for us this year. Not that it isn't in previous years, but we want to make a difference this year in that very worthwhile event that the Marine Corps does. So that's my report.
Questions?
Makes me feel good about the Long Bridge vote earlier.
I think that was the intent. Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Sorry.
We have three action items.
Yes, I was going to recognize you, Madam Chair, for those
And
items.
they will not be controversial. The first action item would be to approve resolution 2397, which would authorize distribution of VRE's fiscal year 2019 CAFR. The audit opinion states that the VRE statements in all material respects fairly and accurately present the financial position of the organization. So moved.
Second.
Motion's made and seconded. Any discussion on that one? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstained, unanimous. Next one.
And our next action item would be to approve resolution 2398, which would approve the 2020 VRE legislative agenda. The agenda was presented as an information item at NVTC's November 14th meeting. So moved.
Motion's made and seconded. Any discussion on this one? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstained, passes unanimously.
And then lastly, our fiscal year 2021 budget update. The preliminary fiscal year 2021 VRE budget presented to the Operations Board in September included a funding gap of $2.1 million And since that time, VRE staff was able to eliminate that gap, and the budget is currently balanced. The final budget will be presented to the Operations Board on December the 20th, to then be recommended for commission approval at NVTC and PRTC's January meeting. So that's not a motion, just an update.
Okay,
And that's it, Mr. Chairman.
thank you very much, and that is your last report to us.
That's my last.
So, yes. Yes. All right, Director Mitchell has left us for the evening because she's wise, and so her report is in the packet. So if anybody has questions for DRPT, then they can contact her or Kate. So we will move on to item 11, which is the proposed FY21 NVTC General and Administrative Budget and proposed 2020 work plan. We are not voting on this tonight. However, the Executive Committee did approve what's in front of you, the General Administrative Budget and the work plan for consideration by the Commission. Scott's going to present that for us tonight, and then this will come to the Commission for the January meeting. There'll be a public hearing on this work plan. The proposed General Administrative Budget has a base budget as well as an option for the additional of a new financial staff position, which we will talk about. The Executive Committee did recommend approval of the budget with that new staff position, which does have an increase in the overall jurisdictional subsidy of, I think, $237,000 spread about amongst all the jurisdictions. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, this year we are proposing a base budget and also an option budget, which includes the additional financial position. The budget document that you have in front of you, the base budget starts on page 1 with the option shown on pages 7 and 8. So looking at the document, page 2 shows the expenses for the base budget. Total expenses decreased slightly, you can see, about 0.5%. When we pull out the commuter choice expenses, which are funded entirely by toll revenues, the operating budget shows an increase of $197,300, or 8%. So this increase is driven mostly by 3 budget lines: salaries, retirement contributions, and rent. The salary line, of course, is the largest line in the budget, and then the increase is caused by an allowance for merit and COLA increases. The increase in the other 2 lines are due mostly to one-time situations. The retirement contribution line shows a 17.5% increase, and that's due largely to recently hired staff becoming fully eligible to participate in the pension plan in fiscal year 21. The other line is the rent line, and NVTC moved into larger office suite in March of 2019, and that lease calls for the abatement of rent for about 29% of the space that we rented out for the first 12 months. And that abatement period runs out through March 2020. So that means this proposed budget is the first year without this full abatement, which causes the large increase. Shifting to how the budget is funded, which is on page 1. As I mentioned, the commuter choice program is fully funded by toll revenues. So the primary funding source for the balance of the budget is from our member jurisdictions. The proposed base budget would increase these contributions by $130,100, or 5.9%. And as I mentioned, the details of the budget option are shown on page 7 and 8. And the only difference from the base budget and that version are the estimated costs associated with adding that new financial position. Under that option, jurisdiction contributions would increase by $237,500, or 10.9% over the prior year, as compared to the 5.9% in the base budget. Any questions?
Questions so far? No? That's it then.
I want to keep it brief.
Okay. Nobody has anything.
Wow.
Okay.
I trust you. Good job.
Well, all right, we're still gonna go to hearing next month, and we still will have a vote on this in the commission next month, so. And I do say that there has been correspondence with the jurisdictions about the subsidy. changes. However, those of you who do represent a jurisdiction, probably not a bad idea to go back and make sure that they're paying attention to this and just that they're aware that if there are any concerns that those get expressed, since there is an increase. Okay. NVTC Transit Resource Center. We're gonna have a real brief highlight.
Very brief highlight, but I want to give Dina, who works on this data all the time, the chance to provide us some highlights in transit ridership.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tonight I'll be providing a high-level summary about regional ridership and metro parking utilization. This quarterly report is compiled at the end of each quarter and reflects WMATA and local systems data by comparing FY19 and FY20 and includes transit boardings for all modes and year-to-date parking utilization. First, I'll be talking about the FY 2020 first quarter transit performance. Overall, local bus and metro bus in Virginia is showing ridership trending upwards in the past quarter, with exception of Dash, which experienced a decrease caused by the 2019 platform shutdown and ongoing construction at King Street Metro Bus Loop. Metro Rail in Virginia is showing 1% decrease in ridership due to several large capital projects that included primarily the 2019 shutdown and also included single tracking. VRE has experienced a 3% increase in ridership. For the FY 2020 first quarter parking utilization, overall parking utilization experienced a 4% decrease as parking was provided at no cost for Huntington, Van Doren, and Franconia Springfield during the shutdown. The parking utilization data collection was suspended for the duration of the shutdown at these stations, and these stations reopened on September 8th. So to summarize, the platform shutdown has impacted local and WMATA ridership as well as parking utilization. Additionally, the detailed report regarding ridership and the parking can be found in the kit. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Yes, sir.
So thank you, Dina. So is it your sense, were you able to control out, were it not for the platform improvement work, that essentially it sounds like we'd be looking at probably slight up numbers across Northern Virginia for the across all modes, parking, rail, and bus?
In comparison from FY19 to FY20, there was a 2% increase. So
2% increase on bus overall, right?
yes, yes.
And the slight decrease in rail is probably all attributed to the platform work,
Yes.
right? And the parking probably would have been made up if we had normal parking programs and collection. So, thank you.
Mr. Lemoyne.
Well, just further to point, the stations that are not affected by the summer shutdown on this chart are all up double digits
Right.
over the year
Right.
before. So I think that's outstanding.
It's
news.
great, isn't it?
So whatever's going right, you got to just keep it going.
Okay. Good. Thank you for the good news. Okay, Executive Director report.
Well, I've got my written report in here. We already talked about Monday's event. And we have a WMATA committee coming up on Wednesday, December 18th. And as a reminder, we will not be meeting on the first Thursday in January. That is January 2nd. I hope that all of you are doing other things other than being in this building. We will be meeting on January 16th. And so wanted to make sure that we did that so that we could introduce some of our new board members, many of which will be sworn in potentially earlier that week. So, so January 16th will be our next meeting. And once again, as we mentioned, VACO VML Day is on February 6th. And so we probably will not be doing, this time we don't plan on doing an NVTC meeting in February. So we'll have a lot of items in the middle of January and then reconvening back in March. And that is all I have for my report.
Bless you.
Yes.
Good work.
Record time.
All right. Any questions for Kate, though? None? Okay. Speaking of then, we have one final item on the agenda. It is this big envelope here. There is a blue sheet in front of you. This is an amendment to the contract with the executive director, or the direction that the performance review discussion we had at our last meeting. This amendment is reflective of that discussion that we had in the meeting, and I am going to move approval of the third amendment to the employment agreement with Kate Mattice as the NVTC Executive Director, and that the chair be authorized to execute it on behalf of the commission.
Second.
Which is made, seconded by Ms. Bristol. Any discussion on this motion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries unanimously. All right. Well, happy holidays, everybody. Merry Christmas, or whatever holiday that you do celebrate. We look forward to seeing everybody here next year. Not everybody. Okay. We are adjourned.
I can say I'll be thinking about you, but.
I've enjoyed